Hey, if you're new to my channel, then consider liking and subscribing. It would really mean a lot to me, and honestly, it'd make my day. If you already did, thank you so much. Oh, and by the way, if you like listening to fan fiction, check out my other channel. The link's in the description.
One Piece Legends by xAlreadyOverx. Luffy dreams of becoming the queen of the pirates, not just to find the One Piece, but to prove Shanks wrong after he told her she could never be king. Armed with the powers of the gum-gum fruit and a fierce determination, she set sail despite her inability to swim, relying on her loyal crew and trusted first mate to survive the dangers of the Grand Line. But as the journey unfolds, Luffy begins to experience strange, unfamiliar feelings, especially whenever her stoic swordsman is near. Could it be more than just friendship? Or is this just one more mystery waiting to be unraveled on the high seas? And before we start, a massive shout out to the warlords of this channel: Case Clark, Leaf5_SCXR, Tristan Ward. You three are the backbone of this community. Your support means the world. Seriously, thank you for standing with me. If you want to join the ranks of these legends, hit that join button and become a channel member today. Let's grow this thing together. Much love, and as always, adios.
Pearl's Iron Wall. The aura around the Bharati was tense in the wake of Mihawk's disappearance. Don Krieg's galleon had been forced away from the restaurant after the swordsman had sliced it up, and there was now enough distance that the invading pirates would have to swim if they wanted to get close enough to launch their attack. Krieg just huffed, his arms crossed over his chest and a steady air of confidence still emanating from him as he surveyed the Bharati and its assembled chefs. They posed no real danger to him, after all. An excited whoop drew his attention to the left side of the restaurant, where the raven-haired waitress who had stood up to him earlier was resting precariously against the railing of the Bharati, an excited grin on her face. "Huh. They want to fight too," she laughed, shielding her eyes from the sun with one hand as the other rested against her hat, making sure it stayed on her head. "This is so exciting." Luffy turned her head so she could get the head chef in her line of sight, kicking her feet out in front of her in a childish manner. "Hey, old man, let's make a deal. If I kick him out, I won't need to work here anymore, okay?" Her voice held no sign of hesitation. She wasn't asking a question of the old man, she was making a statement. Zeph grinned at the she-pirate's boldness. In truth, he was a little reluctant to let her go. She might have been a terrible waitress and broken more dishes than he thought was possible for a single person, but he had made really good tips on all of the tables that she had waited. The girl really had a way of winning people over, no matter what she did. At the same time, after seeing the way that she had launched herself at Hawkeye's Mihawk after he had struck down Roronoa Zoro, he knew that a spirit like hers couldn't be chained to a single place. Also, if Mihawk had been right about the relationship between her and the swordsman, Zeph knew he'd have a furious fight on his hands if he tried to keep her any longer than he already had. He chuckled slightly and crossed his arms over his chest. "I guess that's all that I can hope for. If I really let you work here for a year, this restaurant would cease to exist." Luffy laughed and pumped a fist into the air with a cheer, excited that she had finally got the old man to agree to let her go. She hadn't wanted to just run off on him, after all. Luffy paid her debts and she was happy that she got to solve this one by beating up someone that had already annoyed her. Before Luffy could move from her spot on the railing or even begin to plan how she was going to fight while surrounded by water, Zeph took a few steps forward and placed a hand on the she-pirate's shoulder. "Young lass, you said in the restaurant that your dream was to become the queen of the pirates, right? Are you serious about that?" "Yeah, of course." Luffy wrinkled her nose, and fixed Zeph with the same look she had given everyone else who questioned her dream. "I will become the pirate queen, and I'll be the one to find the One Piece." Her tone was exactly the same as when she had declared her dream to Mihawk, as if it was the most obvious thing ever, and Zeph felt himself smile. "I see a lot of people who talk beyond their strength," he chuckled, watching Luffy with an almost fond look on his face. "But I rarely see someone who says it so confidently, without the slightest hesitation." Luffy giggled and rubbed a finger under her nose happily. "I heard that you were once a very strong pirate, old man. Did you also want to become the king of the pirates?" Luffy turned more so that she was completely facing Zeph and waited for the head chef to reply with an excited and almost odd expression on her face. Zeph huffed slightly and glanced up to stare at the circling seagulls that flew above the restaurant. "I have forgotten about the past. Right now, I'm the head chef of this restaurant. That is enough." His gaze returned to Luffy and he fixed her with a steely look, silently conveying that he would not speak on the matter any further. The she-pirate just grinned and shifted her eyes so that she could catch a glimpse of Sanji. The blonde assistant head chef stood a few feet from Zeph, staring at his feet almost sadly, his signature cigarette gritted between clenched teeth. Luffy knew that whatever Zeph wasn't saying had to do with her new friend, and so she didn't push. The she-pirate actually liked Zeph. The way he treated the other chefs, and especially the way he was around Sanji, reminded her of Shanks and his crew. She knew that no matter what he said, the blonde chef regarded Zeph in much the same way that Luffy herself regarded Shanks. So she just brightened her grin and nodded at Zeph before turning to look back at Don Krieg and his ramshackle group of men, already itching to fight so that she could follow after Zoro and the rest of her crew. "Men," Krieg shouted, getting the attention of his remaining crew even as he pointed towards the Bharati. "As long as we have that ship, we don't need to fear the Grand Line anymore." Before, Krieg and his men had managed to take down enemies by either disguising themselves as the Marines or by flying a white flag of surrender and then launching their raid. But now, after looking at that ship, one crew member muttered, frowning slightly, "Yeah, no one will ever imagine that it's full of pirates." After that thought was finally voiced, Krieg's men began to feel more confident. Many responded with cries of affirmation while others just grinned and hefted their weapons, once again prepared to attack the floating restaurant. But Don. Everyone turned to stare at the lone man who had carefully made his way closer to his captain, a sword clutched loosely in his hands. "Even though we can go back to the Grand Line, what will happen if we meet someone like Hawkeye's Mihawk again?" Don Krieg growled angrily before pulling one of his pistols from its holster and shooting the man who had dared to question him. He didn't even spare a glance as the pirate fell back into the ocean, dead, and instead swept his gun around at the crowd of remaining crew members. "What are you still afraid of? Do you think that a normal person can split a ship in one stroke? That is the power of the devil's fruit. According to legend, there are lots of people in the Grand Line who possess the power of the devil fruit. Like Mihawk, who must have used a special power to cut the ship apart." However, Krieg turned and pointed his gun towards the Bharati, aiming straight for Luffy, the girl just watching him calmly. "That wench is a devil fruit user as well. When we take this restaurant, we will have both her and the logbook of Redfoot Zeph, who survived on the Grand Line for an entire year. As an ordinary man, he must have some strategy to deal with monsters such as those. A strategy that is most likely written down in the journal that he possesses. With that knowledge and the little bitch's ability, we will be unstoppable." The men around Don Krieg began to cheer, excitement and a renewed sense of confidence filling them at their captain's words. They all turned, almost as one, and fixed the floating restaurant with hungry looks, readying their weapons. "Let's go and steal the ship." Sanji took a drag of his cigarette and turned away from the cheering pirates so he could survey the crowded deck of the Bharati. There was not enough space for them all here. With the deck being as crowded as it was, the Krieg pirates would quickly gain the upper hand. They needed more room to fight because he would not allow anyone to take away the old geezer's treasure. This restaurant will become a battlefield. Sanji felt himself zone out slightly as memories of the first time he had met Zeph flashed through his mind. He could still picture everything as clearly as if it had happened only the day before. "I was thinking about a restaurant on the sea. If I can survive and leave here, I'll bet the rest of my life on a huge restaurant. A restaurant is my final purpose." Sanji opened his eyes, not remembering when exhaled a puff of smoke from the cigarette before smirking slightly. He would not let anyone come near the Bharati without going through him first. It was his silent promise to the old geezer, one that he would never say out loud. Instead, Sanji turned his head to the right and gestured to one of the chefs. "Hey, go to the control room and open the effin'. That. Open the effin'. If we open that, we'll just be giving the enemy a foothold." "Who cares?" Sanji chuckled, patting the wall of the restaurant reassuringly. "We can't let the inside of this restaurant become a battlefield. If we fight inside and make a mess, the old fart'll never shut up." Zeph slid his eyes to the side and glared slightly at the blonde teenager. "Did you say something, you little brat?" he grumbled. "Yeah, I said you never shut up." Sanji waved his hand at the chef dismissively. "Now get going." "Sure." The man took off towards the back of the restaurant, but Sanji had once again turned his attention towards Don Krieg and his men, many of who had already started making their way towards the Bharati. Luffy hopped off the railing and onto the main deck, grinning excitedly. They're finally here. Here they come. The raven-haired girl cheered slightly before grabbing the railing and starting to step back. Okay then. Here I go. She continued to step back into the dining area of the restaurant, her arms stretching as she moved. Gum gum. Rocket. Luffy allowed herself to be launched forward and off of the ship, aiming straight for the closest group of charging pirates. And gum gum. Scythe. The she-pirate stretched her arms far out to the sides as she approached the men, clotheslining them as she passed and knocking the entire group back and into the water. Krieg snarled angrily as his men continued to drop into the water around him, and he glared at the small waitress girl as she stretched out one arm and latched onto one of the masts of the ship. It had been broken off and was now tilted at such an intense angle that it almost touched the water. The raven-haired girl allowed herself to be yanked toward the mast and windmilled around it a little bit before finally managing to get her footing. She giggled as she settled down into a sitting position on the mast, watching the men that she had knocked back flounder in the water, many still stunned from her attack. That little bitch, Krieg thought, gritting his teeth together as some of the chefs on the Bharati began to cheer for the girl. Way to go, waitress. What the hell is she? One pirate muttered, pulling himself onto a floating section of deck as he struggled to catch his breath. He was in shock over the power that the tiny girl displayed, having not expected that much force behind the girl's attack, and all around him pirates who had been knocked back by her let-out noises of agreement. Sanji just stared, unable to pull his eyes away from Luffy's happy smile as the girl surveyed the damage she had caused with her attack. His cigarette was held loosely between his lips, as if he didn't even realize it was still there as he quietly began to mutter. In the Grand Line, there are more people like her, of course. Sanji had heard the stories of the dangers of the Grand Line and the people with inhuman abilities that made it their home. But to actually see someone like that here in the East Blue. Sanji, the blonde teen, flinched, snapped out of his thoughts at Zeph's call, and turned to look at the old man with a curious look. The head chef didn't turn to see if his protege was looking at him as he continued talking, his attention focused solely on the battle that had just started between the Straw Hat Lass and the infamous Don Krieg pirates. Watch carefully how she fights. Watch her until the battle finishes. Zeph grinned slightly, looking almost excited at the thought of seeing more of what the small she-pirate could do, and Sanji frowned at his mentor. This was a side of Zeph that Sanji hadn't seen in years, and it left him slightly confused, but he did what the old man said and turned his attention back to their temporary waitress, curious as to what she would do next. They gave you food to eat, but instead you attacked them, Luffy chastised, pointing a finger at Don Krieg and frowning at the purple-haired man. You don't even know how to be grateful. I'll send you to the sky. Maybe you'll learn some manners there, but probably not, idiot. The raven-haired girl stuck her tongue out and Don Krieg just chuckled, amused. You've chosen to fight on the sea where there is nowhere to stand. Krieg gestured around him before fixing Luffy with an amused smirk. Obviously, he had the upper hand and he would use this advantage to its fullest. I know people who possess the power of the devil fruit are afraid of the sea. Anchor girl. Luffy just grinned, unfazed by Krieg's words, but I can stretch instead. Before Krieg could respond, the water around the Bharati, and therefore the galleon's wreckage, began to churn. Sanji. The FN is going to open, Sanji smirked, pulling his cigarette from his lips and letting out a puff of smoke. Now, the real fun would start. The chefs around him seemed to know what he had planned and all began to heft their weapons in expectation as the rumbling beneath the restaurant grew louder. What is this? Luffy asked excitedly, her eyes darting around as she tried to spot the cause of the change in the water. Krieg just scoffed slightly, his stance uninterested but his eyes betraying his slight curiosity in the new events that were unfolding. A large shadow began to appear in front of the Bharati, growing even larger as it neared the surface of the water. As it began to rise above the ocean, the water pouring from it caused waves that pushed the Krieg pirates back and caused the various pieces of debris to rock, throwing those still on the wrecked galleon deck off balance. What the hell? A platform just appeared out of nowhere. The large piece of wooden deck that was slowly forcing itself out of the water stopped when it was flush with the deck, allowing Luffy and the invading pirates to get a good look at it. It formed a large half-circle in front of the entrance of the Bharati, and Luffy could just barely make out an identical piece of wooden deck on the opposite side of the restaurant. "Wow!" Luffy cheered, letting go of the mast with one hand and pumping her fist into the air. She looked like a kid in a candy store and was grinning almost giddily. "That's so cool." Sanji just shoved his hands into his pockets and moved around the chefs still crowded on the small outer deck so that he could step out onto the large new platform. He glanced over at Krieg, looking completely calm, an aura of confidence pouring from him. "Now, why don't we fight to our heart's content, pirates?" "Oh, so I see. You set up a battlefield so that the restaurant itself wouldn't be harmed. You've made things more convenient for us." Krieg smirked slightly. "Now I want this ship even more. Don't you even think about having this restaurant?" "Yeah, don't underestimate us, we're fighting cooks." One by one, the chefs of the Bharati made their way out onto the large wooden platform, all of them hefting their weapons and looking ready for the fight they knew was coming. Another loud rumble came from the Bharati, and everyone turned to look as the fish head that symbolized the bow of the ship slowly began to pull away from the restaurant. The head was connected to a small body with a large striped canopy over what looked to be the control passenger section of the small ship, and 3 cannons emerged from the fish's mouth. "Let's go." Luffy blinked, slightly confused when she saw Patty and Carne sit up in the control section of the small warship. "When did they get there? I didn't see them leave." "The Bharati's sea weapon, Sabagashira #1, Luffy giggled as she watched the 2 men start to paddle, her position on the mast allowing her to see the bicycle-like pumps that allowed the warship to move. "So cool, I want one too." Carne pedaled faster as they turned to small ship to face the Krieg pirates and the wreckage of the galleon before firing the 3 cannons. The cannon blast shook the wreckage, throwing some of the pirates back and into the water, and even Luffy had to grip the mast she was on tightly as it began to rock. Patty and Carne just continued to fire, the former laughing as he watched their targets struggle to stay above water, looking like drowned rats. "Don't look away now, we're aiming at him," Carne chastised, smacking his partner even as they turned to aim at Don Krieg. "Krieg, take this, we'll show you the power of Bharati Restaurant's sea weapon." Even as Patty yelled, Carne was already firing the 3 cannons, and the shots slammed directly into the pirate general, throwing up chunks of wood and dirt around him and obscuring their view. The 2 chefs continued to paddle straight for the deck Krieg had been standing on, intending to ram it when their ship came to a lurching halt. "What happened?" Carne muttered, sitting back up as he had been thrown forward by their sudden stop. "Did it hit something?" The smoke had since cleared, revealing Don Krieg looking completely untouched. He had one hand out and braced against the center cannon of the warship, seemingly preventing the ship from moving, even though it appeared to be more than 10x bigger than him. "I am Don Krieg," the purple-haired pirate snarled, his expression completely livid. "The man who will conquer the world's sea." "I've told you before that I'll be the one to do that," Luffy protested, frowning at the man, but Krieg just ignored her. "I don't have time to play these games." Don Krieg tightened his grip on the central cannon, and then, to everyone's horror, the self-proclaimed ruler of the East Blue lifted the warship into the air using only one hand. "What strength is this?" Patty shouted, gripping onto the steering bar in an effort to keep from falling out as Krieg lifted them higher and higher before tossing the ship over his head and towards the Bharati. "It's flying over here, the restaurant is going to be destroyed." The chefs on the Bharati began to panic, scrambling about as if they weren't sure whether to flee or still attempting to look for some way to stop the large approaching ship. Sanji took a drag of his cigarette with a sigh, still standing in the center of the wooden platform and looking completely unconcerned. Calmly, he bent his legs before launching himself up and into the air, causing the pirates in the water to gasp in shock. Luffy just followed Sanji's movement with her eyes, her mouth open in awe as she watched him flip easily through the air as if he was flying before extending one leg and kicking out at the small warship, batting it away as if it was nothing. The ship crashed down on the edge of the large wooden platform, away from the restaurant and other chefs as Sanji dropped back easily onto the platform in a crouch. All around the platform, the Krieg pirates began to mutter amongst themselves, watching Sanji with wide and disbelieving eyes. "What a kick! He just kicked away that strange ship thing." Even Krieg was slightly surprised that the cocky blonde cook he had dismissed as nothing had kicked a boat that probably weighed more than a ton as if it was just a tin can. Was that kick technique? He muttered, frowning. He had heard the stories before and knew there was only one person that could kick like that. It appeared. Sanji's kick. One of the chefs cheered and the others joined in, but Sanji just ignored them, perking up when he heard a high-pitched laugh. Whoa, not bad, Sanji. That was so cool. The blonde chef immediately turned to look at where Luffy was once again sitting easily on the bent mast, clapping her hands together excitedly even as a bright smile formed on her face. Hearts began to float around Sanji and he quickly stood up before dancing over to the part of the platform that was closest to Luffy, spinning around almost like a mini tornado. Luffiko-chan, your praise makes my heart sing. That a beautiful angel loves my fighting skills makes all of my training worthwhile. That kick was for you, my sweet. Sanji continued to dance around the edge of the deck, even as the other chefs sighed in exasperation and the pirates watched the blonde man, wondering if he had lost his mind. Sanji was broken out of his love-struck rambling, however, when Patty and Carne forced themselves out of the wreckage of the small warship, both storming towards the blonde chef angrily. Sanj, you bastard, Patty snapped, shaking his fists at the assistant head chef. You trying to kill your own people? Carne asked, glaring. Yeah, Sanji muttered, sounding bored even as he rolled his eyes. What do you mean, yeah, I'll cook you like an octopus? Carne was forced to hold Patty back even as he pointed an accusatory finger at their fellow chef. You nearly lost two powerful weapons, you Italian spaghetti. Before Patty could push Carne off him and attack Sanji, a low chuckle to his left drew everyone's attention. Some of the Krieg pirates had finally pulled themselves up onto the Barate's wooden deck and were sneering disdainfully at the arguing chefs. The cooks gathered around Sanji, Patty, and Carne quickly charged the pirates, yelling out loud battle cries as they did. However, even though all of the chefs had experience fighting, none of them stood any chance against the Krieg pirates. They were not known as the most powerful in the East Blue for nothing, and in less than a minute, they had managed to disarm and knock back every chef except for the three that had not immediately charged them. Sanji's expression darkened with rage at the sight of his fellow shipmates, his family, being knocked around as if they were trash. Patty was furious as well, even more so when the pirates began to insult them, insisting that they weren't ready for the sea and that they spend their time cooking on the mainland instead. Announce it, Krieg ordered, glaring at Sanji. Tell everybody that this ship belongs to the Krieg pirates. Sanji just scoffed, smirking slightly. Forget it, you won't step 1 foot inside here. We've been cooks for more than 10 years and we've worked in 300 restaurants. During those days, we'd be fired every time we started a fight. Patty's glare softened and his eyes glazed over slightly as he became lost in a memory, remembering the first time that he and Carne ever set foot on the Barate. Then finally, we arrived at this place, Carne added, smiling as he thought back to that time as well. He and Patty had been the first two chefs to join Zeph's restaurant. When they first arrived, it had been just the old man and a much younger Sanji, alone in the large ship. And here, we can fight and cook as much as we want. There isn't another restaurant like this. All around them, the other chefs began to perk up as they also thought back to the day when they had been hired and accepted into the family by head chef Zeph and the little blonde, foul-mouthed child that followed him around. This place wasn't just a job to them. It was their home, their family, and their most irreplaceable treasure. Standing at the back of the deck, in front of the entrance to the dining area, Zeph smirked, his eyes moving to his blonde protege who looked even more determined to protect this place than he had before. That's right. Sanji agreed, shoving one hand in his pocket. Understand, Krieg? We will never give this place up as long as we breathe. Every day, preparing meals is like a battle. These guys are nothing compared to those days. Patty shouted again, and their memories combined with their fellow chef's words lifted the cook's spirits. They began to force themselves to their feet again, grabbing the weapons that they had dropped, ready to protect the Barate once more. Right. Let's fight. Protect the owner. Protect the Barate. Patty and Carne charged the group of pirates, easily cutting through the ones in front of them as the rest of the chefs re-engaged the others. This time pushing back the pirates, Patty and Carne's words having bolstered their determination. They had slowly started to turn the tides, when suddenly Patty was sent flying back, the large thuggish cook crashing to the deck with a grunt of pain. Carnate turned towards where the attack had come from, his eyes wide with shock, not really believing that something had managed to take down his partner. What is? A man slowly climbed onto the wooden platform and flicked his hand in Carnate's direction, sending the smaller chef tumbling to the ground after his partner. The big smile that had been on Luffy's face as she watched the fight slowly faded, and she tilted her head curiously as she examined the newcomer. He was big, probably even taller than Zoro and easily twice as wide. He had two large circular metal plates covering his chest and back. He had smaller metal plates on his elbows and hands, and in the center of each circular plates was a large multicolored pearl. From the back, Luffy could see that his hair was dark and that he had a matching giant pearl on his head like a helmet. "Who's this weirdo?" she asked, making a face. The man sighed heavily, as if he was bored to tears, completely ignoring the furious glare that Sanji was shooting him. "What are you doing?" Without even waiting for a reply, the odd man began to laugh and raised his hands before posing slightly. "Iron Wall, also known as the Krieg Pirates' invincible Iron Wall Shield Man. It is I, Pearl." "Patty, Carne, are you boys okay?" Zeph asked, the clenched hands at his side being the only indication that he was even the least bit worried. "How could they be okay?" Pearl chuckled, spreading his arms wide and smirking. "They were defeated by my killing punch, Pearl's present." The man continued to laugh, feeling cocky now that he had taken down two of the strongest fighters at the restaurant. In his boasting, he failed to notice the dark expressions settling onto both Sanji and Zeph's faces, both men looking like they were seconds away from snapping. One of the Krieg pirates sauntered up to where Patty lay and let out a whistle of appreciation before he bent down and grasped the handle of the knife sheathed in the thuggish man's apron. "Sweet. This knife's not bad. I'll take it." The pirate moved to stand back up but was held in place when Patty's hand shot out and grasped the handle of his knife, preventing the other man from taking it. "Let it go. Give it to me. Leave it." The man continued to try and pry the knife from Patty's fingers and failed to notice that Sanji had slowly stepped forward, his face twisted into a mask of pure fury. The man finally noticed that someone else was there when he saw Sanji's shadow fall across Patty's prone body. The pirate glanced up from his task in time to see the blonde cook's foot slam into his face, Sanji's roundhouse kick sending him flying back into three other men. The knife he had been trying to steal flipped out of his hands and into the air, and everyone watched as Sanji snatched the spinning blade out of midair. "He really knows how to kick," Luffy giggled, whistling slightly as she watched the events unfolding on the wooden deck. "We got another strong fighter for my crew. I'm so excited." Sanji hefted the knife before glaring over at the man who had tried to steal it as said pirate scrambled to untangle himself from his crewmates. "A knife is the soul of a cook. An outsider like you doesn't deserve to touch a cook's knife." With that, Sanji turned and knelt down next to Patty before returning the knife to the other chef's hands. The injured cook let out a soft, thankful noise which Sanji brushed off with a scoff. "Hold onto it and lay there. I'll finish these guys off." The pirates that Sanji had knocked back glared at the blonde chef before charging him with a chorus of angry noises and snarls. "We won't be defeated by a bunch of useless cooks." From his place next to Patty, Sanji seemed to completely vanish into thin air, reappearing less than a second later in the center of the approaching pirates. He placed his hands flat against the wooden surface and, keeping his elbows at a 90-degree angle, flipped himself up into a handstand before slamming his feet into the pirates' faces. In the next second, Sanji was back on his feet, and with one sweeping kick that generated a gust of wind in its wake, he had sent all of Krieg's men flying back. "What do you mean by useless cooks?" the assistant head chef snapped, his expression making him look less than mentally sound. "I'll gut you like a fish." Pearl just scoffed and spread his arms wide, gesturing to his fallen comrades dismissively. "Are you so arrogant that you only kick them? Is this your principle?" "I'm a cook, remember? A cook's hands are his life. He cannot injure them in battle. So, I'll be taking you down with these feet instead." Sanji just shrugged as if it was no big deal before he raised one leg and pointed his foot threateningly at the odd, shield-covered man. "Finish me? Impossible. In my last 61 battles, I have won them all completely unharmed. I have never even spilled a single drop of blood in battle." The injured cooks behind Sanji gave each other surprised looks, impressed with the shield man's statement, but Sanji just continued to stare, looking almost as bored as Pearl. But still, the large pirate continued to talk. Not a single drop. This justifies how strong I am. He smirked when he saw the surprised and almost frightened looks on the Bharati chef's faces, glad that he was eliciting such a reaction from them. With a smirk, he clanked together the two shields on his hands, the pearls in the center making a slight bonging sound. I'm the strongest of the strongest, got it? I may be a gentleman, but I'm not gentle. Luffy raised one eyebrow and tilted her head to the side, watching Kriegsman with an almost disbelieving look. Was that supposed to be a joke? Is he an idiot? She couldn't understand why so many of the chefs looked scared of him. Hadn't they seen what Sanji could do? Hell, she could kick that guy's ass. He's not very funny, either. Krieg let out a slight hum when he noticed that the Straw Hat Girl's attention was focused on Pearl and the scene happening on the Bharati fen. The violet-haired pirate smirked slightly before he hefted the ball and chain he was holding and began to spin the large weight, building up its momentum. Hey, Straw Hat wench. If you look somewhere else, you'll get hurt. He launched the heavy, spiked mace forward, the ball easily cutting through the mast just inches from where Luffy was sitting and throwing the Straw Hat Girl into the air. Luffy let out a small shriek of surprise and wrapped her arms around the broken piece of mast that had been thrown into the air with her, knowing that there was nothing but water below her and hoping that the mast would keep her afloat long enough for her to call for help. Unbidden, her thoughts jumped to Zoro as she remembered a day on the Going Merry when she had fallen off the ship nearly 5 times. Flashback, damn it, Luffiko, Zoro grumbled, hefting the small, shivering girl over the railing and tossing her onto the deck of the ship as he allowed himself to catch his breath. He had been sleeping on aft deck, in the middle of a midday nap, when he had heard the splash of water and cut-off shriek that indicated that his captain had once again fallen into the ocean. It was a sound that sent a small surge of panic through his body and made his muscles tense in anticipation. For Zoro, it was the start of a stopwatch that signaled that his captain only had about 3 minutes left to live. It meant that she was helpless and in real danger of dying if he couldn't reach her in time. Zoro felt the sharp shock of pain go through his chest every time he heard that sound because the very thought of Luffy dying, of her leaving him, was unbearable in his mind. With a sigh, Zoro pulled himself over the railing and dropped down next to Luffy before turning the girl onto her side and holding her up so she could get some much-needed oxygen into her. Everything okay? I had to SPL. Nami emerged from the kitchen, where she had been making herself a pot of tea and slowed to a stop when she took in the 2 soaked individuals in front of her. Can you get a towel? Zoro muttered, pulling Luffy further up and shifting her so that she was cradled against his chest. His hands stroked through the she-pirate's raven hair reassuringly as Nami immediately turned and headed down towards the storage room without another word. After about a minute, Luffy's energy returned and she wrapped her arms around Zoro's chest, shivering as she attempted to sap whatever body heat she could from her green-haired swordsman. Nami returned a few seconds later and tossed 2 fluffy white towels towards the swordsman before flapping her hand dismissively and returning to the kitchen. Luffy was obviously okay and Nami wasn't going to get in the middle and attempt to pull the girl from the swordsman in any way right now. Zoro didn't look too happy at the moment and the Oranget was not up for getting into a shouting match with the overprotective swordsman. So, she left the young she-pirate in her first mate's care, telling herself she'd talk with the girl later tonight about her tendency of falling into the ocean. Zoro quickly wrapped one of the towels around Luffy's shoulders, letting out a sigh of relief as his body came down from its slight adrenaline when he realized that Luffy was going to be okay. Again. Once his relief passed, however, the anger settled in and Zoro pulled the small girl away from him so he could grip her shoulders and stare at her face. What the hell were you doing? That was the 4th time today, Luffiko, the 4th time. Luffy shifted tiredly in Zoro's hold and pouted up at her first mate apologetically. Sorry, Zoro. I was looking at something cool and Zoro didn't want to hear any more excuses. His relief had faded but the adrenaline was not completely gone from his system so he snapped slightly, cutting his captain off mid-sentence. What if something happened once, just once, and Nami, Usopp, or I couldn't get to you in time? Think about it, Luffy. Obviously, you don't fall in on purpose, but it's like you don't care if it keeps happening. I care. Luffy's words became heated and she pulled herself out of Zoro's hold, trying to glare at her swordsman but still feeling utterly exhausted from the seawater, causing her stern look to fall flat. Zoro saw this and it made his heart thud against his chest painfully. He was still angry, even more so when he saw how sick and pale Luffy looked after just 2 minutes in the water, but he had sworn to himself that he wouldn't yell at her again without thinking his words through, not again, so he took a deep breath and exhaled noisily through his nose, trying to rein in his anger. "No, Lu, you don't care," he finally said, his words forced. "You need to stop being so reckless." "But I don't need to worry," Luffy replied, smiling softly and reaching forward to grab Zoro's hands, which had dropped to the deck after they fell from her shoulders. "Because I have Zoro. Nothing will stop you from reaching me, I know it." Zoro was taken aback for a second, having forgotten how much Luffy seemed to rely on him. The thought filled him with a warm feeling, but he pushed it down because while Luffy was right, things weren't that simple. "That's true, Lu. I won't let anything stop me from saving you, but what if I'm not there?" That single sentence caused a lump to form in Zoro's throat and he swallowed heavily, his mind imagining the scenario even as he said it. He had seen her helpless in the water many times, and the idea that she could fall in when someone him wasn't there to grab her and she would just continue to sink into the depths caused him to shiver slightly. On her end, Luffy wasn't doing much better. The she-pirate had bit her lip, Zoro's words forcing her to realize that her first mate was right, but not really wanting to think of a reason why her swordsman wouldn't be by her side. Zoro had promised to stay with her and she knew he wouldn't break that promise, so that meant. She averted her eyes and, seeing his opening, Zoro drove his point home. "You need to stop assuming that I'll always be with you during that 3 or 4 minute gap that makes the difference in whether you live or drown." The she-pirate just stared down at their intertwined hands before she sighed and looked back up at her first mate, giving him a small nod. "Okay. I guess. I'll try to be more careful, Zoro." Zoro smirked slightly and moved one hand to ruffle Luffy's still wet hair before he turned and grabbed the second towel to dry himself off. "I guess that's all I can hope to get from you. You're a troublesome captain, Lu." The smile returned to Luffy's face and Zoro returned it wholeheartedly even as the girl started to laugh. She. Flashback ends. Luffy was yanked from her thoughts when the spiked mace slammed into the piece of mast that she was holding onto, Don Krieg having pulled the weapon back and readied another attack while the she-pirate was zoned out. The force of the hit sent Luffy flying back, flipping end over end, and she was forced to let go of the wooden mast, silently hoping that Krieg's attack had sent her towards a stable foothold. Back on the Barate's fin, Pearl was still gloating about his many victories and the odd-looking man brought one of his hand shields up to cover the lower half of his face as he chuckled. "Even the Marine's cannons can't resist me. No attacks can hurt me." Sanji's attention was pulled from the shield man when he saw the small blue and white blur heading towards the deck. His eyes widened when Luffy slammed into the back of Pearl's head, the hit slowing her momentum and flipping her up and over the man's pearl-shaped helmet before causing he to drop to the ground in a heap. Sanji was immediately at the she-pirate's side, resting one hand against her lower back and the other on her elbow as he helped the dizzy girl to her feet. "Ah, Luffy-chan, you're not hurt, are you, Angel?" Luffy's whole world seemed to be spinning and she held onto Sanji for a few seconds until everything began to come back into focus. "Ah, he scared me." Finally shaking the last of the dizziness from her vision, Luffy straightened up and pulled herself out of Sanji's hold before patting down the front of her blue uniform skirt dismissively. "I nearly fell into the sea," she muttered, pouting. "And Zoro's not here." Sanji frowned slightly at the green-haired swordsman's name, but before he could say anything else, his attention was drawn to Pearl. The large shield man appeared to be frozen, one shaky hand raised in front of his face. When Luffy had slammed into the back of his head, Pearl was thrown forward and into one of the shields on his arm, the hit injuring his nose and causing it to start bleeding. The man just stared at the small bit of blood on his fingers from where he had pressed them to his throbbing face. "Did I do that?" Luffy asked, tilting her head to the side, as she watched the odd man with a slightly curious expression. With a shrug, the she-pirate moved to rest her hands behind her head, and grinned semi-apologetically. "Sorry about that." "Shit," Krieg muttered under his breath, his tone annoyed. The rest of Krieg's pirates seemed to be more afraid than annoyed and many on the Barate's fin were beginning to sweat. "Oh no, blood." "Pearl, Everything is alright, it's only a little nosebleed. Pearl, don't worry about it. The man in question just began to shake, sweat breaking out all over his body and his eyes glassing over slightly. This is dangerous. Sanji just raised one eyebrow, looking slightly bored and not the least bit interested in what was wrong with his opponent. He looks strange, what happened to him? He asked, not really wanting an answer as he placed his cigarette back in his mouth. Luffy just shrugged, watching Pearl like he was slightly crazy. Suddenly, the large man began to bash together the shields on his hands, Kree noise. Stop it, Pearl, Krieg ordered, raising one hand and pointing at his underling. Don't get mad over a nosebleed. Krieg's words went unheard though as the tempo and volume of Pearl's clanging began to increase and the shield man added to the noise by yelling danger over and over again. After a few more seconds of this, he spread his arms wide and both Sanji and Luffy jumped slightly when every part of the man's shielded body was suddenly covered in blue flames. Shit! One pirate yelled. When Pearl feels threatened, he sets himself on fire. Luffy turned to look at the man who had spoken with a disbelieving look. He does what? Fire Pearl. Special favor. From his hands, the shield man shot out small flaming pearls in a wide arc, not caring who he hit. Bits of the deck went up in flames as the pearls struck the wood, while others slammed into some of the pirates, lighting his own teammates on fire. Sanji was forced to jump back to avoid one of the pearls and Luffy flipped back as well, using a one-handed back handspring to avoid the spreading fire. Ow! That's hot, she shrieked, not appearing overly worried as she shook out the hand that had gotten too close to the fire. Hey, you guys! Pearl smirked, his look that of a wolf that had cornered its prey. With these shields of fire, I'm indestructible. On the ruined galleon across from the Bharati, Krieg cursed slightly and crossed his arms over his chest as he stared at the burning deck. That idiot, is he planning to burn the ship we're trying to steal? Luffy danced from foot to foot as she tried to avoid the moving flames. One hand braced against her straw hat even as the edge of one of her sandals caught fire and she had to stamp it out. Hot, hot, hot. Shit. Sanji muttered staring at the fire as the chefs around him began to mumble. He really wants to burn this restaurant. Burn, burn, Pearl shouted, raising his hands high above his head. Sanji's eyes narrowed angrily and he snarled. This was Zeph's restaurant, it was that old man's dream and Sanji wouldn't let anything happen to that. Not after all that he had taken from the old man in the first place. Bastard! The blonde chef snapped, leaping forward and into the fire. Near the entrance to the restaurant, Patty cried out a warning, Carne having to hold him back before the thuggish chef could move to help Sanji. Stupid, you're gonna get fried. Don't you dare burn this restaurant. Sanji ignored him and flipped up into the air, aiming a kick straight for Pearl's head. Before it could connect, Sanji's kick was blocked by one of the shields on Pearl's hand. The pirates that hadn't been lit on fire by Pearl's attack watched as the blonde chef easily jumped back from Pearl and landed only a few feet away from the flaming man, surrounded on all sides by fire. None of them could really believe what they were seeing. How come that guy's so impudent? One muttered, turning to his crewmate. Isn't he afraid of becoming a fireball? He even attacked Fire Pearl, someone who is feared even by beasts. Sanji heard their words and chuckled before pulling his cigarette from his mouth and pointing it at them. Idiots, he smirked, shaking his head. If I'm afraid of fire, then how can I call myself a cook? Pearl ground his teeth together and glared at the chef. Arg, what an annoying guy. Sanji returned his attention to Pearl as he took a drag of his cigarette. Get this, moving quickly, he leapt forward into a handstand and slammed the heel of right foot directly into Pearl's face, knocking the large man back onto the ground. Everyone around the platform was in shock as they watched Pearl force himself to his feet again, blood steadily dripping from the lower half of his face as his eyes began to tear up. What kind of cook is he? This isn't good, the man cried, pressing one hand against his face to staunch the flow of blood. Damn, damn, damn it. Fire Pearl keeps on burning. He threw his hands out again, launching another barrage of flaming pearls into the air. This second attack was aimed straight at the Bharati, Pearl knowing that the blonde chef in front of him wouldn't be able to stop his attack before it hit the restaurant. The restaurant is going to be set on fire, one of the chefs yelled worriedly. If those fireballs get into the kitchen, then the restaurant is finished. The pearls headed towards the entrance of the Bharati where Zeph stood calmly, his arms crossed over his chest. Head chef Zeph. Run away, head chef. Zeph just glared at the approaching attack and, raising his peg leg, performed a powerful horizontal kick. The power of his attack forced him to spin slightly, but the strong gust of wind that followed his kick put out the flames and caused the metal pearls to drop harmlessly to the ground. The middle-aged chef calmly dropped his leg back down even as the Krieg pirates stared at him in shock. "My fire pearl. This is nothing," Zeph finally said, smirking at Pearl in a manner eerily similar to the blonde chef still standing in front of him. The Krieg pirates glanced between each other shocked. Is it that red-leg Zeph still has his skills? Luffy let out a whoop, grinning brightly. The old man is strong. Finally fed up, Krieg tightened his hold on the chain of his spiked mace and glared at the restaurant. "If that's how it is, then I'll sink you and your effin' into the sea before the fire burns the restaurant." He began to spin the mace to build up momentum before launching it at the fin. The spiked ball aimed straight at Pearl and Sanji. "Sanji, get out of there," Patty yelled, seeing the incoming attack. "He can't, he's surrounded by fire." Sanji just stared at the large mace, his eyes wide as he scrambled to think about what he should do. Pearl wasn't much better off, staring up with his mouth open and his eyes wide. Suddenly, a flash of blue to Sanji's left caught his attention and he watched, wide-eyed, as Luffy jumped through the fire separating Sanji from the rest of the Bharati. One hand was braced against the girl's iconic straw hat in an attempt to protect it from the flame, even as the fire licked at her arms and legs. "Hot, hot," she shrieked, sliding to a stop in front of the blonde chef. "Luffiko-chan." The raven-haired girl just grinned happily before stretching her arms back as she prepared her attack, the spiked mace drawing dangerously close. "Gum gum. Bazooka." Luffy leapt up as her arms snapped forward and she slammed her open palms onto two of the smooth parts of the spiked ball, launching it away from the ship even as the weight of the mace and its momentum threw her back onto the deck. "She shot back that spiked ball," Sanji muttered, turning to stare at the she-pirate with wide eyes as she sat up from her place on the ground and batted at a part of her skirt that had caught fire. The blonde chef shook his head to clear it and held a hand out to the girl to help her to her feet. "Amazing, Luffiko-chan. That was incredible." The mace that Luffy had launched back slammed into the base of one of the upright masts to Don Krieg's right, knocking it towards the fin. Sanji saw the post coming and quickly scooped Luffy up into his arms before leaping out of the way. But Pearl, who was facing away from the falling piece of wood, didn't know it was coming and was unable to move in time. The large mast slammed into the man's head, knocking him unconscious instantly and dropping him to the ground. "Pearl is defeated," one of the pirates yelled, his eyes wide and sweat dripping from his face. Sanji carefully set Luffy back on her feet on a safe part of the deck and raised one eyebrow in Pearl's direction. What was he doing? "Dunno, that guy was stupid." Luffy just giggled and shrugged her shoulders. "Every single time," Krieg growled, cracking his neck as he glared at the raven-haired girl and the blonde chef standing near her. "If you want something done, you gotta do it yourself." Suddenly, a cry of pain echoed from behind Luffy and Sanji and both quickly turned, worried. Their eyes wide. Zeph had been knocked forward onto his stomach. A man stepped from the shadows and placed a foot between the middle-aged man's shoulder blades to keep him from standing up, causing Luffy to frown. "Jin?" Sanji's gaze narrowed slightly as he stared at the brunette man, his mouth turning down as he watched the pirate he had helped pull a gun out and point it at Zeph's head. "This time you can end it, right? This battle is over," Jin said, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, shoot him. Kill Redfoot Zeph and this restaurant will be ours," Krieg laughed, exhilaration flowing through him now that he had the upper hand. Jin looked down, his eyes shaded by the sweatband he wore on his forehead. He didn't want to look at Sanji, not now. Luffy's hands just curled into fists at her sides, her body tensing in anticipation. She had to find some way to get that gun pointed away from Zeph. "Jin. Living is the true obligation, Jin." Luffy was a mix between furious and shocked, not quite believing the scene in front of her. She knew Jin, she knew he was a decent guy, an honorable man, so why? Why was he doing this? The man in question glanced at her for a second before looking back down at the middle-aged chef at the end of his double-barreled shotgun. In that second though, Luffy was able to see a little of what was going through the other pirate's mind. In his own small way, Jin regretted what he was having to do, but he was cornered. She could see it in his eyes. He felt like he had no other choice. Regardless of how great a man he was before, now he's just an ordinary chef. Blasting his head off is no problem now. Jin said quietly, flexing his hand against the handle of the gun before allowing himself to look at the blonde chef. "You want to save this man, don't you, Sanji?" His tone turned slightly pleading. "So just heed my word and get off this ship. I don't want to have to kill you." The chefs weren't the only ones stunned by the brunette's words. All around the deck and even in the water, the rest of the Krieg pirates were watching Jin with slightly confused and disbelieving words, as if they couldn't believe what he was saying. "Leave this ship," Sanji repeated, as if he wasn't sure that he had heard Jin right. His brow furrowed slightly before he brought his cigarette to his lips and took a drag of the calming nicotine. The blonde chef scoffed before glaring up at Jin, looking slightly annoyed. "Not a chance." Jin's eyes widened in shock. His mouth opened to reply, but Sanji had turned his gaze away from the pirate and was now staring down at his mentor. "You look pathetic, old fart. In that state, you don't deserve to order us fighting cooks around." His tone was calm, as if he was commenting on the weather and not speaking to a man with a gun pressed against his head. Zeph just scoffed, appearing as unconcerned as Sanji as he frowned back up at the assistant head chef. "I don't need to hear that kind of crap from you, you baby eggplant." "Would you stop calling me names?" the blonde chef screamed, practically snarling at the middle-aged man. "Quit treating me like a kid already." Sanji appeared livid, his hands clenched at his sides and his teeth gritted around the cigarette between his lips. Many of the chefs jumped back slightly in shock, not used to Sanji getting this angry over the owner's typical name-calling. "That damned Sanji," one snapped, a hand against his chest as he watched the argument with wide eyes. Another made a slightly worried sound. "He's not gonna abandon the owner, is he?" Everyone at the Bharati knew of the volatile relationship between the two head chefs and the fact that they constantly argued and insulted each other. They had always thought it was their way of showing affection or how they dealt with working together, but now, some of the chefs began to wonder if Sanji even cared about Zeph at all. Did he want the older man to die? Sanji pointed a thumb at himself and glared back up at Jin, appearing slightly more calm, if no less determined. "Hey Jin, I..." Suddenly, a hand latched onto the back of Sanji's suit, cutting off the blonde chef as he was roughly yanked backwards. He glanced back in shock, eyes widening as he took in the small raven-haired girl standing next to him. She slowly released the suit collar before giving the confused chef a small grin even as she placed her other hand on his chest and gave him a shove. As she pushed Sanji back, Luffy took a few steps forward herself and turned to look at Jin. "Hey Jin," she yelled, spreading her arms out wide, "aim that pistol at me." Zeph started slightly and glanced up at the raven-haired girl confused. From behind her came a sound of protest. "Luffiko-chan, what are you doing? Stay back please, you'll get killed." Luffy threw a grin over her shoulder, and winked, appearing slightly amused. "Maybe." Jin's grip on his shotgun faltered somewhat and he stared at the small she-pirate with a disbelieving expression. "Girl, why? This doesn't concern you. If you're so eager to die, let me do the honors." The smooth and annoyingly familiar voice came from behind Sanji and the blonde chef turned to see Pearl slowly forcing himself to his feet, looking furious. "I owe you one for my nose, you loud, obnoxious girl." The large shield man grinned menacingly. "Don't you dare move now. Move and Jin will blow your boss's head off." Jin cringed slightly, but didn't say anything as Pearl began to charge towards Luffy and Sanji. "Luffiko-cha, don't move, Sanji. Ultimate killing technique. Pearl present." Pearl jumped into the air and brought back one shield-covered fist before slamming it into the side of Luffy's still smiling face, knocking the girl back. She tumbled to the ground and slid, coming to a halt when her back slammed into the wooden railing of the Bharati. "Luffiko-chan," Sanji shouted, starting forward even as Luffy pushed herself up into a sitting position and wiped at the small trickle of blood dripping from the left side of her mouth. "Luffiko-chan, why didn't you dodge that?" The blonde chef moved to kneel down next to Luffy and rested a hand against the girl's back to help her sit up more, but Luffy just brushed his hands off and grinned up at Sanji. "If I did that, then Jin pulled the trigger." Sanji's gaze moved to the brunette, who was watching the she-pirate like she was crazy. "Why are you doing all this, girl? You said you were a pirate. Why risk your life for a stupid restaurant?" Jin couldn't understand what was going through her head, but Luffy just smiled brightly at him and crossed her legs, her hands moving to grip at her ankles. "This restaurant is important to Sanji. Sanji is my nakama and he wants to stay here. I'm not going to let you guys take this place from them. Besides, a silly little hit like that won't stop me." Her real goal was to get Jin to point his gun at something other than the old man, but it wasn't like she couldn't take a few hits from the odd shield guy while she thought of a plan. They were like Grandpa's stupid fists of love, and it wasn't like she was in any real danger of dying. Jin turned to Sanji, his gaze beseeching. "Sanji, please, if you just abandon this restaurant, everyone will be saved." Sanji shook his head, squeezing Luffy's shoulder in a silent thank you, which caused her to turn her smile towards the blonde chef. He returned the smile with a soft one of his own before standing back up and moving so that he was in between Luffy and the others. This time, he would protect her. He wouldn't allow a lady to be hurt in his presence. "This restaurant is that old man's treasure." Sanji's words were forceful, growled between slightly clenched teeth as if he was angry that Jin had even suggested that he leave. Patty and Carne both stared at Sanji in surprise, watching as the fight seemed to deflate out of the assistant head chef all at once, and he slumped forward slightly before continuing. "I'm the one who took everything from that old fart." All of the confidence from his previous statement was gone as the memories flooded his mind. It was as if he was back on that tiny island made of rock with no food or water, a knife in his hand as he stared at the slouched back of Redfoot Zeph. His power. Sanji remembered seeing the blood as Zeph swam down through the freezing water in an effort to reach Sanji, to save a boy he barely knew from drowning. And his dreams. Zeph frowned at the ground silently as Luffy and the others stared at Sanji with varying expressions of surprise. Luffy knew that this was what Zeph had silently warned her about earlier. She didn't know if the old man's dream had been to be the king of the pirates, but for some reason, Sanji felt that he was responsible for causing Zeph to abandon that dream. That was wrong though. Zeph didn't blame Sanji, Luffy knew that. She watched Zeph quietly as Sanji straightened himself back up, his voice growing stronger and louder as he continued. "That's why, now, I anything from him again." Zeph gritted his teeth angrily and Luffy recognized the expression as one Ace used to give her before he hit her because she was being stupid. Zeph was frustrated. He had always known that Sanji was foolish, but his little idiot had gone overboard this time. Yes, he loved this restaurant, but it wasn't his only treasure. Didn't the kid understand that? "Sanji, watch out." Patty's voice cut through both Zeph and Luffy's thoughts, and the raven-haired girl whipped her head around in time to see Pearl standing behind Sanji, his arms thrown wide. Pearl cross. The large man slammed the two shields on his hands together, catching Sanji's head in between them and causing the blonde chef to let out a scream of pain. Luffy could hear the sounds of Sanji's skull cracking from where she was sitting, horrified as streams of blood began to pour from the blonde's nose, mouth and ears. He slowly began to fall, Pearl's hit leaving his ears ringing as his vision slowly faded to black. He couldn't even hear the worried calls of his fellow chefs as he dropped to the ground with a thud, unconscious. But even unconscious, his mind was full of memories. All blue. The legendary seaware fish from the East Blue, West Blue, North Blue, and South Blue can all be found. Sanji remembered the 3 cooks that he used to work with on the crew's orbit. Had they died during the storm? He never found out. Everyone had probably died in that freak storm. After all, it had destroyed 2 galleon-class ships. That was where he had first met Zeph. The old man had been a pirate that had appeared during the run of the Mill Evening Storm, intending to rob everyone on the ship. Sanji had grabbed 2 knives and fought back, earning Zeph's attention. "A kid that wants to die so badly, just kill him off already. Like I'm gonna die, I have to get to the All Blue someday." A large wave had struck the ship and he remembered being thrown overboard. Sanji had thought he was going to die, but Zeph had come after him. A pirate that had looted his ship and beaten him up dove into the freezing water to save a single kid. To this day, Sanji still didn't understand the old man's reasoning. He had asked Zeph once what had happened that night. The chef had told Sanji that the storm had gotten really bad and wrecked both ships. Zeph and Sanji had both survived because they had already been underwater at the time the large wave hit. However, Zeph's leg had gotten stuck in the debris and he was forced to use an anchor line to break and sever his right foot. Sanji had woken up on a tiny, mushroom-shaped island with only a small bag of food and no way to get any more. He couldn't even remember how many months had passed on that little island. Eventually, he had run out of food and was left to stare at the vast ocean, hoping that a boat would pass by and he could escape this nightmare. He and Zeph had sat on opposite sides of the island, hoping to have a better chance to spot something, but it wasn't until later that Sanji learned that Zeph had given him all of the food, the older man's bag of rations, holding only treasure. Why? Why did you save me? I don't remember asking you to treat me so kindly. Why? You have the same dream as I do. Hey, old man, don't die. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a restaurant somewhere on this vast sea? If I managed to escape this hitch, I'd bet everything into building my own restaurant. Then, I can help you do that. Hey, for a weakling little eggplant like you, that'd be impossible. I'll get stronger, I won't be a burden to you, so, don't die. As the memories faded, consciousness returned to Sanji and he clenched his hand into a fist as he remembered the last day on that hellish island. What Zeph had done for him. He was more determined than ever now and his knuckles slowly turned white and his hand shook. That old fart. He gave up his leg so that I could live. The chefs of the Bharati watched Sanji with wide eyes as the blonde shakily started to push himself to his knees. They had never heard anything about the relationship between Zeph and his protege, but the fact that their assistant head chef was going this far meant that they were wrong. Sanji did care about Zeph, more than they had ever thought. Luffy was once again on her feet and made a move to help Sanji up, but the blonde held out a hand and shook his head at her, wanting Luffy to stay back. This was his fight. Luffy had already done more for him and this restaurant than she needed to. In Sanji's opinion, she had completely paid off her debt and he would handle the rest from here. With a last grunt of effort, Sanji was back on his feet. His face was covered with blood and he looked like he was barely able to remain upright, but he stood his ground, sliding one hand into his pocket and gesturing to himself with the other. I too. If I don't place my life on the line as well, I won't be able to repay the old man for his kindness. Luffy stared at Sanji from her place near the railing of the Bharati, her mouth downturned in a frown. Her expression was mostly blank, but there was a slight flickering of anger behind her eyes. Jin just continued to stare at Sanji, wide-eyed, as if he couldn't understand why. Why was Sanji standing back up? He must have voiced his question out loud because the blonde glanced over at him and smirked. Staying down is a little too much like giving up. If I can make this restaurant last for just one moment longer, that'll be fine. That bastard. Is he trying to get himself killed? Patty muttered, slightly worried. Even though Sanji was foul-mouthed and acted like a gangster with a bad attitude, he obviously cared about Zeph and this restaurant more than anything else. And even though they argued with him and shouted at the blonde chef, Patty and the others felt the same. That stupid little eggplant, Zeph muttered quietly, annoyed. His attention was drawn to the left of his charge where Luffy was standing. The girl's eyes were shadowed under her hat, but Zeph could tell from just the curve of her mouth and the shaking of her fists at her sides that she was furious. He didn't know what had pissed her off, but she was obviously gearing up for another round for which he was thankful. Yet another refined speech, Pearl mocked, spreading his arms out as he gestured to the restaurant around them. But now, this restaurant will be out of business. From now on, it will be a pirate ship. That is it. Everyone's attention was drawn to Luffy, a little shocked by the absolutely livid expression on the girl's face. She just let out another scream of anger and kicked her right foot straight up into the air, her skirt flaring up and revealing the small black short shorts that Nami had insisted the girl wear after her first day at the Bharati. Sanji averted his eyes, his face a bright red, and this time, the small bit of blood dripping from his nose wasn't from an injury. It took him a few seconds to compose himself and realize what it was that Luffy was doing. No, Luffy-chan. What are you doing? If you attack, then Jin will kill the old geezer. The others just stared at Luffy, surprised. What's that girl thinking? When Luffy's foot wouldn't stretch any higher, she tore her gaze from it and glared down at the wooden fin beneath her feet. Gum gum. Axe. Her foot began to retract, building up speed as it raced back towards the deck, and Luffy slammed it angrily into the floor beneath her, cracking the fin and sending water everywhere. Water rained down on the deck, a part of the aftereffects from Luffy's strike. Luffy continued to kneel, one hand digging into her bent knee as she glared down at the cracked portion of the deck beneath her. Sanji just stared at the small girl in front of him, the rocking of the deck piece he was on forcing him to sit down heavily. Jin couldn't take his eyes from the raven-haired girl, the shotgun in his hand shaking slightly as he gaped at her. The girl was crazy, absolutely nuts. Even back then, when she had smiled as she talked about the GRN, she was crazy even back then. Why was he even surprised anymore? Underneath the heel of Jin's boot, Zeph smirked slightly. The lass had guts, he had to give her that. Maybe destroying the outer part of the fin would talk some sense into his idiotic, self-sacrificing protege. Zeph could only hope. Across the gap on the destroyed galleon, Krieg was less than happy. The fin. The fin is destroyed. The large wooden fin had been split into 5 pieces of varying sizes. The cracks in the wood all traced back to a central gap where Luffy's attack had connected with the deck, the girl in question kneeling mere inches from the edge of her broken section. Luffy just smirked at Krieg's furious tone, her eyes hidden by the brim of her straw hat. She slowly pushed herself completely to her feet, still staring down at the wood beneath her feet. That bitch. Is she planning to destroy my ship? Krieg ground his teeth together before jabbing his finger towards Jin. Jin. Blow his head off. The brunette flinched back slightly, his eyes widening as he glanced between his captain and the man held hostage beneath him. Hurry up, Krieg snapped, seeing his subordinate's hesitation. But, he's the one who gave us enough to feed our men. Jin's voice wavered slightly and he sighed, looking slightly downcast. His quiet words only seemed to anger Krieg further. Jin, you bastard. He snarled, furious. When had his trusted lieutenant become so soft-hearted? I wasn't fighting back at you. Luffy's words caused everyone's attention to turn to the raven-haired girl as she calmly turned to look at Krieg with a relaxed expression on her face. I only destroyed the fin. The calm and almost reprimanding expression on the girl's face seemed to infuriate Don Krieg even more as veins of anger began to appear on the man's forehead. His teeth ground together and he looked about ready to blow a gasket. Sanji didn't appear to be very pleased either. Luffy-chan, he snapped, his voice taking on a slightly harsh tone. He had never really raised his voice to a woman before, but this girl was actually starting to frustrating him. What are you trying to do? Do you have any idea what you've already done? I'm gonna sink it, she said, as if it was obvious. What? Sanji couldn't believe what he had heard. Was she serious? Luffy turned away from Krieg to glance over at Sanji, fixing the chef with a determined expression. I'm going to sink the ship, she repeated. Her words caused the chefs in the water to stare at her in shock, as if they couldn't believe what she had just said. Even Krieg's pirates were surprised by her words, many watching her with fear in their eyes. Are you joking? They shouted, some of them even waving their fists in her direction. This girl was crazy? First she had taken Pearl's hit in an effort to defend the restaurant and now she was trying to destroy it herself. Sanji shook himself out of his shock and forced himself to his feet before running over to where Luffy stood, rocking slightly on the broken pieces of deck as he moved. Luffy-chan, I thought you were gonna say something else. He grabbed the girl's shoulders, shaking her slightly as he continued. No, what were you thinking? You can't sink this ship. But if I destroy the ship, they can't get what they want. Luffy just watched Sanji calmly, appearing unconcerned even as Sanji's grip on her shoulders tightened. Unnoticed by the both of them, Zeph smirked, his chest swelling with appreciation for the she-pirate. And what do you know about this? Sanji snapped, letting go of Luffy and shoving her back slightly. His anger was overriding his normal doting demeanor and, staring at Luffy, he no longer saw a woman to fawn over but an infuriatingly stubborn pirate who was bent on driving him nuts. What do you know about the immensity of my debt to this place? Luffy just crossed her arms over her chest and glared at the fuming blonde chef in front of her. So you're going to die for a crummy old restaurant? Are you stupid? Luffy's words caused Sanji to grind his teeth together and he stared at the small girl in shock. What did you say? The raven-haired girl uncrossed her arms and took a few steps forward before shoving Sanji in the chest, sending the chef back a few steps. It's not about death, she growled, shoving him again, her face contorted in anger. Dying isn't paying him back. That's not what he put his life on the line for. Her words caused Sanji to flinch slightly, as if he'd been slapped, and Luffy continued, jabbing a finger into the center of the blonde's chest. He saved you so that you could live, yet you want to die? Only a weak person would act like that, you idiot. Sanji gaped at the tiny girl glaring up at him, his own words drying up in his throat as hers echoed in his mind, running circles through his head. He almost couldn't believe that this was the same person he had spent the past week with. Luffiko had always acted happy. She was energetic and even a bit naive, but Sanji had thought that she was adorable. This woman in front of him was different though. She was strong, passionate, and frustratingly stubborn. Sanji would almost find her beautiful if she wasn't getting in his way. Sanji had always respected women. They were beautiful and delicate creatures that deserved to be worshipped like the jewels that they were. Their intelligence and poise made each one unique, and Sanji had always loved getting to know each and every woman that came through the Bharati, doting on them in an effort to show that they were appreciated. But Luffiko-chan was the first woman to actually frustrate him, and that left him speechless. Jin watched Luffy and Sanji argue, his gaze focused more on the she-pirate. He was almost as enthralled as Sanji, the girl's determination and self-confidence causing him to admit to himself that he respected the small girl. He glanced down at the middle-aged man that he was holding hostage and frowned, knowing that he couldn't bring himself to shoot the defenseless man. The girl, Luffy, deserved more than that. He would take care of this himself. Oh, both of you. Stop arguing. Sanji turned his gaze from Luffy's still frowning face to glare over at the annoying shield man that Luffy had knocked out earlier. Apparently, he had decided that he hadn't had enough. Fighting amongst yourselves at a moment like this is just laughable, Pearl smirked, forcing himself to his feet and flapping his hand dismissively in their direction. But, regardless, you can't do anything now because we have a hostage in our hands. Sanji cursed under his breath, knowing that he was right, and Luffy just stared at the shield man, looking slightly annoyed. How unfortunate for you that you had to face us, the Don Krieg pirates. Jin's finger twitched against the trigger of the shotgun at Pearl's words, his eyes shadowed by his gray and blue headband even as the other man began to laugh. Now let my fire pearls burn you down. Pearl slammed the two shields on his hands together, covering them in the odd blue flames before he charged towards Luffy and Sanji. Jin's shotgun clattered to the ground next to Zeph's head, startling the middle-aged man slightly as Jin disappeared from his place behind the head chef. Before Luffy or Sanji could move or even think to counter-attack Pearl's approaching attack, a blur shot between them, shoving the two teens to the side as it charged towards Pearl. As Luffy stumbled to the side, she noticed Jin approaching the shield man, two baton-shaped weapons with metal balls the size of cannonballs at the end gripped in his hands. Jin ducked under Pearl's attack and slammed the cannonball-shaped end of the weapon into the center of the large shield on the odd man's chest, completely shattering it with one strike. Jin! Sanji's eyes widened with surprise at the brunette's move. Why? Jin! Pearl mumbled, falling to his knees as the air was forced from his lungs. The large man couldn't believe that his crewmate had attacked him, especially Jin. Sorry, Pearl. Jin sighed to take in his, now unconscious teammate, and muttered quietly. Just stand aside. The brunette didn't even flinch as Pearl crashed to the ground, his eyes returning to staring straight ahead. Jin! Krieg growled, his whole body almost vibrating with anger. You're betraying me? Forgive me, Don Krieg. Jin said, bowing his head slightly in a sign of respect. This person saved us. I don't want him to die like this, at least. Jin turned back to face Sanji, resting the ball of one of his Tonga weapons against his shoulder. At least. Let me finish him with my own hands. His calm words and relaxed demeanor shocked Sanji and the others around him, but Krieg just sighed in resignation. That's just great, he remarked. My pirate fleet battle commanding officer has completely lost his marbles. Ignoring the odd words of the brunette pirate, Patty and Carne made their way across the broken pieces of wooden deck towards where Zeph was slowly forcing himself up into a sitting position. Owner, are you okay? Carne asked, kneeling next to Zeph and placing a supporting hand against the middle-aged man's back. Patty's words were less kind. Owner, get a grip on yourself. Sanji glanced back at the three chefs, his lips twitching in a small smirk. He was glad that Zeph seemed to be okay, but there were more pressing matters that demanded his attention, speaking of which. Battle Commanding Officer, Sanji muttered, his words drawing the attention of Zeph and the others. So he's not a regular crewman. Patty gulped, a little afraid because he had been the one to deny the brunette food and kick him out of the restaurant. Yeah, Carne remarked. He broke the shield of the Iron Wall man. What a frightening power. Luffy sighed slightly, looking frustrated at the new turn of events. Jin saved Sanji from Pearl so that he could kill him instead because Sanji deserves to die against a real opponent and Jin is the only opponent that has that right. It was all making her head spin. Still. It looks like my decoy strategy to get Jin to release the old man worked. Luffy giggled, placing her hands on her hips and grinning widely. I thought you wanted to destroy the ship? Luffy brought a finger to her forehead and tilted her head in a show of thinking about it. If that's what would have saved everybody then yes. Sanji opened his mouth to argue back with her but was interrupted by Jin calling his name. I wanted you to get off this ship so that I wouldn't have to hurt you, the pirate said calmly. But it doesn't look like that's gonna happen. Yeah. I won't go, Sanji agreed, shrugging his shoulders. This restaurant, I won't give it to you even if it costs my life. Then at least, let me kill you with my own hands. I can't make this right or wrong. Thanks, Sanji snorted, lighting another cigarette. Eat shit. Jin turned to look over at Luffy. The same goes for you, Straw Hat Girl. Not necessary, Luffy said, looking completely uninterested. Because I won't lose to a bunch of weaklings like you. Luffy's words were said without a hint of inflection, as if she was stating a fact or talking about the color of the sky. Jin clenched his teeth at the insult, not believing that the girl had dared to say those words with such an indifferent air. Jin wasn't the only one in shock. The rest of the Krieg pirates were absolutely furious that the small girl had dared to insult their second-in-command to his face. You little bitch. How dare you talk to our commander like that? Calling him weak to his face. We are the Don Krieg pirates, the strongest in East Blue. Luffy's brow furrowed slightly in confusion and she crossed her arms over her chest before tilting her head to the side. Don't you mean, the ones with the most people? That did it. Luffy's words had completely destroyed what pride the Don Krieg pirates had left and they were absolutely furious. Sanji snorted. Looks like you hit him where it hurts. Luffy giggled and stuck out her tongue at some of the pirates shaking their fists in her direction. I guess so. We'll kill this bitch ourselves, they shouted, pushing themselves up onto the wooden planks and charging the raven-haired girl. Back off, Krieg's crew halted at the angry shout, some of them flinching as they all turned to look at their captain with varying levels of shock. Don Krieg, but Krieg stood up from his spot on the deck of his ruined galleon and crossed his arms over his chest, addressing his men calmly. When a guy gets flustered because someone calls him weak, it's proof that he recognizes he is weak. Don Krieg sat back down heavily and rested his hands against his knees before continuing. Let the outcome determine the weak and the strong. I'm still here, so don't make a fuss. The crew shouted, grinning happily, Luffy's previous slight against them completely forgotten. Jin, you're responsible for killing that cook, Krieg ordered, turning his attention away from his commander and the blonde chef to glare at the raven-haired girl. As for the insolent little bitch, Don Krieg smirked slightly. Leave her to me. I have plans for breaking her before I make her our new crewmate. Sanji's frown deepened and his eyes narrowed at Don Krieg's tone. He didn't really want to let that asshole anywhere near Luffy-chan, but it would be difficult if Jin really was serious about trying to kill him. Even just watching the man move, Sanji knew that the brunette would be a difficult fight. I understand, Don Krieg. Jin conceded, nodding to his captain before turning back to face Sanji. Luffy glanced over at Sanji calmly, appearing completely unruffled by Don Krieg and Jin's words as she watched the blonde chef take a drag of his freshly lit cigarette. Little girl. Luffy's attention was pulled back to Krieg and the purple-haired pirate captain fixed the girl with a serious look. I'll show you the power that conquered East Blue. I don't care if you've eaten a devil fruit. You will come to understand such a thing is meaningless against me. He would teach her easily. Devil fruit or no, the girl was small and thin and he had his battle armor on. The raven-haired bitch stood no chance against him and after he proved that, he would take great pleasure in breaking her. By the time Don Krieg was done with her, she would be an obedient little weapon. As Krieg talked, Luffy's calm expression began to harden into one of annoyance. Finally, having had enough, she scoffed and shook her head. "You never shut up. I want to kick your ass, that's it." Krieg's own expression darkened, and seeing this, Luffy smirked, her expression sarcastic and yet still excited. "Shall we start now? You just wait right there for me." "You arrogant." Krieg was beyond furious now, and he gritted his teeth, thinking of all the ways that he could break the raven-haired girl grinning cockily at him. The pirate captain was distracted in his musings by the tense atmosphere coming from his battle commander and the blonde chef. The two combatants were locked in a staring contest, neither one willing to break eye contact first, even as the atmosphere grew thicker with each passing second. The Krieg pirates in the water watched the brewing tension with wide eyes and grins on their faces. They knew full well that the thuggish blonde cook stood no chance against their vice commander. "That guy can't tell strong from weak," one pirate laughed, already feeling victorious. "This time that cook will be finished." "Yeah," another agreed, nodding his head. "If Jin takes out that weapon, he's serious." Jin removed the tonfa from his shoulder and began to spin it by the handle, the ball at the end forming a perfect circle as he picked up speed. Soon, the weapon was spinning so fast you could barely see the individual features of the baton, and still Jin continued to spin. His eyes were narrowed in a look of pure concentration, his gaze dark and menacing. This was going to be a rough fight, and Sanji knew it. His eyes never left the other man's face even as he prepared. HHAD managed to destroy Pearl's shield with one hit. That alone proved that the brunette pirate's strength was above Sanji's. He himself had not been able to land a single scratch on the large shield, but Sanji also had his speed to factor in. "They call him the Devil Man." Sanji heard the Krieg pirates continue to talk and couldn't help but listen in, even as he tried to stay focused on the opponent in front of him. No matter how much his opponent pleased for mercy, he would always kill him without any hesitation. A Devil Man. A human with no feelings. Sanji let all emotion fade from his face, putting on his mask of calm indifference even as he began to tense. Jin's expression was slightly unnerving, nothing like the weak and pleading man he had been the first time that Sanji encountered him. Now he was deadly. "I'm sorry, Sanji," Jin finally said, his tonfa spinning faster and faster. "You can't defeat me." "I guess we'll see, small fry." Sanji was baiting Jin with the casual way he said it, but he couldn't really help himself. Jin's leg muscles tensed and he leaned forward, his eyes half shadowed by his headband as he prepared to attack. Sanji felt his eyes widen slightly in shock as the brunette began to charge him, and he quickly raised one leg in preparation of a counterattack. "Here we go." Zoro sighed and leaned back against the wooden plank that made up the bow of Johnny and Yosaku's small ship. The wounds he had received in his duel with Mihawk throbbed and burned under the bandages, but Zoro could hardly feel them, his gaze and attention on the horizon behind them. Johnny told him that he had been unconscious for a while and that he and Usopp had sent Yosaku back to report to Big Sis Luffiko once they realized where Nami had taken the Going Merry. The fight at the Baratie was probably in full swing, if not completely over by now, and that thought left Zoro feeling irritated. One of his hands slid along the sheath of Wado, the sword propped up against his shoulder, as he subconsciously tried to soothe himself. At that moment, Johnny stepped calmly from the small cabin in the center of the boat. His eyes flickered over Usopp, who was sleeping on one of the side passages that led to the back of the boat, before he turned his gaze to Zoro. Honestly, Johnny was amazed that Big Bro Zoro was still alive, let alone sitting up and appearing as if he wasn't even in pain. But the stark white bandages across the man's chest attested to the fact that he was far more injured than he appeared. The bounty hunter sighed when he took in the pirate hunter slowly sliding his thumb across his beloved sword, even as the man's steel-gray eyes stayed focused on the path they had come from. Johnny kinda wanted to tease the green-haired swordsman about how worried he appeared, knowing that a certain raven-haired girl was occupying the other man's thoughts, but thought better of it. He had been on the receiving end of Big Bro Zoro's anger when it came to Big Sis Luffiko, and he didn't need the swordsman reopening the wounds he and Usopp had barely managed to get under control. "Still, you know, Big Sis Luffiko will be fine," he said, a small note of teasing entering his voice. Zoro jerked slightly at the sound of Johnny's voice, and the bounty hunter watched, amused, as the swordsman blinked a few times before focusing in on the dark-haired man standing in front of him. "I know that. He grumbled, glaring up at Johnny as the hand-holding Watto tightened slightly. Luffy can handle herself. It seems like there's a but there. Johnny prodded, moving to take a seat in front of the green-haired teen and holding out a bottle of sake as a peace offering. Zoro smirked slightly and took the proffered bottle, immediately chugging down a large portion of the bitter alcohol. Johnny waited a few seconds for Zoro to reply, and when the other man didn't, he sighed. He shouldn't really be all that surprised. Zoro had never been the most open person to begin with. Hell, it had taken months for Johnny and Yosaku to learn that the green hair was natural and even longer to learn Zoro's age and birthday. Even now, neither bounty hunter knew the story of their big brother's prized white sword. They only knew that it was his most important possession. Big sis Luffiko's probably a close second now, though. Johnny grinned slightly even as he watched Zoro turn his attention back towards the horizon. His own thoughts drifted back to his and Yosaku's first day on the Going Merry. Johnny hadn't believed it at first, but after just a few hours of watching his big bro, it was easy to see how much the small she pirate meant to him. When Yosaku had awoken again, Johnny had told him about his hunch, but the other bounty hunter hadn't believed him at first. No way. This is big bro Zoro we're talking about. The only thing that he cares for is booze and sleep. Yosaku shook his head and grinned at his partner. That, and beating Hawkeyes. Johnny shrugged good-naturedly, not disputing Yosaku's words but wagged one finger in the air in front of him. True, but you haven't seen what I have. Big sis Luffiko's got big bro wrapped around her finger and she doesn't even know it. Come on, I'll show you. Yosaku sighed and glanced around the small storage room. It's past midnight, Johnny. They're probably asleep. Nope. Johnny grinned, looking triumphant. Big sis Luffiko had first watch tonight and big bro Zoro has second, so he's probably still awake so he can keep an eye on her. Or he's just drinking. Yosaku argued. Johnny waved off his partner's protests and dragged the half-complaining man out of his bed and towards the storage door. With a gesture to be silent, the bounty hunter cracked the wooden door to the deck and peeked out. A smirk appeared on his face almost instantly at the scene that greeted him, and he yanked Yosaku forward so that the other man could see. Zoro stood on the upper deck of the ship, near the galley, appearing completely bored with one hand shoved in his pocket. His other hand, however, was being held by Luffy as the raven-haired girl stood on the railing of the ship, walking slowly along it as if she was on a balance beam. Johnny could barely make out the outline of a glass bottle in the girl's other hand, which he assumed was some kind of alcohol. Luffy giggled happily and spun to face Zoro, grinning down at the green-haired teen, her cheeks flushed from the drink. Zoro, look, the moon's smiling. She wobbled slightly and Zoro removed his hand from his pocket to brace it against her waist. Idiot, be careful, Lou. He shook his head with a sigh and smirked slightly. No more alcohol for you. I should have known you had no tolerance for it. Luffy just giggled again and shook the bottle playfully. This stuff tastes weird. How can Zoro drink it all the time? I'm used to it. So, what does Zoro think the moon looks like? Maybe a banana. Or a crazy white mustache. Zoro rolled his eyes and grabbed the bottle from the she-pirate before downing the rest of the alcohol in just a few gulps. The moon's just the moon, Lou. You're just imagining things. Like when you see pictures in the clouds. Luffy pouted slightly and stuck out her tongue. Boo, that's no fun. The she-pirate hopped down from the railing, but Johnny noticed that Zoro didn't remove his hand from her hip or release his hold on her hand once she was back on solid ground. In the bounty hunter's opinion, the swordsman's hold was quite possessive. Luffy didn't seem to notice, however, and instead smiled up at her first mate, bouncing slightly from foot to foot as she stared into steel-gray eyes. They stood in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, content just to stare at each other, before Zoro finally opened his mouth and spoke. Your smile. Luffy tilted her head at the soft words and Zoro glanced away, embarrassed, before clearing his throat. You said the moon looks like it's smiling. But your smile is brighter than the moon's. You smile like the sun, Lou. The raven-haired girl smiled even wider and Zoro returned it with. Zoro's so silly, she laughed, rubbing one finger under her nose in embarrassment. Even if Nami calls you a brute and Usopp says you're scary, Zoro's just a softie, isn't he? You should smile too. I love Zoro's smile. Zoro flushed slightly under the praise and Johnny chuckled as the green-haired swordsman turned away from his captain before bringing the hand that had been resting against her waist up to ruffle at her hair. Zoro? Johnny chuckled slightly, causing Zoro to glance at him funny as he remembered that night. He and Yosaku had stayed to watch for a bit longer but had quickly scurried back to the hammock room at the end of first watch. They didn't want Big Sis Luffiko, or especially Big Bro Zoro, to catch them spying. It had taken a few more days of pointing out little moments between the she-pirate and her first mate, but in the end, it was watching Big Sis Luffiko curl up next to Zoro during one of the swordsman's afternoon naps that had finally convinced the second bounty hunter that the green-haired teen was in love with the small girl. Yosaku had never seen Zoro allow anyone so close to him while he was asleep, and at the same time, the swordsman had seemed to relax even further when the girl was within arm's distance. The former bounty hunter had seemed happier and more open in the past few days than he had been in their years of traveling with him. Johnny followed Zoro's gaze to the horizon behind them and he frowned slightly. Be safe, Yosaku. Big Sis Luffiko. The battle commander strikes. Krieg scoffed as he watched Jin face the blonde chef and the straw-hatted girl, a shark-like smirk coming to his face. The final result of this fight will be what decides who is strong and who's not. By the end of this, I will be the one left standing. Luffy rolled her eyes, a little fed up with how the purple-haired pirate was acting. She had dealt with people like him before, but his arrogance was really starting to grate on her last nerve. Talk about leadership. Patty whistled, appearing grudgingly impressed by the pirate commander's self-assured words. His title, Don, as the fleet admiral of 50 ships, isn't just for show. Carne agreed with a nod. So, little girl. Krieg turned his full attention to Luffy, chuckling when he noticed the raven-haired girl glaring at him. Tell me, who do you think is more fit to become the Pirate King, you or me? Me. Luffy stuck out her tongue at Don Krieg, ignoring the shouts from Patty and Carne telling her not to egg on the pirate commander any further. Krieg's confident smirk dropped and he snarled before forcing himself up from his seat even as he grabbed the shield attached to his left shoulder. Alright, that's it. Move it, men. It can't be. A few of the pirates in the water near the destroyed galleon flinched back as they watched Don Krieg heft the shield. The pirate commander shifted so that the face of the shield was pointing towards Luffy and the Bharati, the man's Jolly Roger clearly visible on the golden surface. It's time to teach that little bitch over there the true meaning of strength. At this point, the rest of the pirates in the water had noticed what Don Krieg was doing and they began to panic as well. It's the MH5. Wah! Jin flinched, turning his attention from Sanji to look back at his captain as Sanji and Luffy just stared on curiously. Don, wait. Huh? The various chefs of the Bharati began to notice something was wrong based on the reactions of Jin and the other pirates, and even Patty and Carne were staring at the shield with semi-worried expressions. MH5. Luffy crossed her arms over her chest and shifted all her weight to one leg, watching the shield with a curious, if slightly bored, expression. If it's a cannonball, I'll just bounce it back, you know. She watched as Jin turned to fully face his captain and the dark-haired battle commander spread his arms wide. Please, Don. Allow me to kill this man with my own age. Whether you kill him or I do, the result is the same. Don Krieg interrupted, turning his glare to the brunette even as he kept talking. You know that there's nothing I hate more than foolishly naive things like honor or compassion. Listen well. This is a battle we're in. And in a battle, you fight to win. Jin flinched back slightly at Krieg's words, his arms falling back to his side even as he loosely continued to hold onto his tonfa. The skull in the center of the shield opened its mouth, revealing a hole in the center that resembled a large gun barrel. So all you have to do is win. Even if it means using a poison gas bomb. Poison gas. Sanji gaped at the pirate commander as the man's words sunk into his head, his eyes wide with shock. Don, Jin protested. One whiff of this'll be enough to render your entire body immobile. This is strength. With those shouted words and one last glare towards the raven-haired she-pirate, Krieg launched his attack. The shell exploded from the center of the shield with a large bang, causing everyone around the destroyed galleon to flinch. Krieg's pirates pulled metal gas masks from pockets and bags and quickly placed them over their faces, indicating that they were familiar with this kind of attack. Seeing this, the chefs in the water began to swim backwards and away from both the galleon and the Bharati, hoping to put enough distance between themselves and the incoming attack. Crap! Dive into the sea. It's coming. Luffy just smirked, dropping her arms to her side and clenching her fists as she watched the incoming shell. HMPH, I'll just knock it down into the sea. Luffiko-chan, Sanji protested, reaching out to grab the back of her uniform. His fingers brushed the white fabric of her top, but the girl easily shifted her weight and slipped past the blonde chef. Come back. Luffy smirked back at him as she ran. I ain't afraid of a little poison gas. As she neared the edge of the platform, Luffy leapt up and brought her leg back, intending to kick the shell away as it neared her. Jin frowned as he took in the shape of the shell. No, that's not it. The brunette shifted his gaze from the she-pirate to his captain and froze at the confident smirk that graced the other man's face. It was a smirk that said, I know something you don't. Jin quickly swung back to Luffy right as the shell exploded in front of the girl's face. Over 100 small, metal-throwing stars shot from the exploded shell, forcing Luffy to brace herself as the sharp spikes sliced at her arms and legs. Sanji and Jin were both forced to jump back to avoid being hit by the throwing stars that were quickly embedding themselves into the wooden deck. What is this? One of the chefs in the water asked, staring wide-eyed at the unexpected attack. Shrapnel. Luffy dropped to the ground amidst the metal stars with a slight cry of pain, and the chefs could see at least one throwing star sticking out of her left shoulder. Luffy winced, yanking out the star and quickly covering the wound with her free hand even as blood dripped from other cuts along her legs. Oh. Ha! A shrapnel shell. It was just a trick, the pirates cheered, removing their masks as they did. You suck. Luffy muttered, pouting even as she glared over at Krieg. Ha ha ha. A single poison gas bomb is enough to entirely wipe out a small town. As if I'd waste it to kill you two pieces of trash. He's a real bastard, isn't he? Sanji sighed, kneeling down next to Luffy and pulling a handkerchief from his suit pocket to press against her shoulder. Luffy nodded her agreement before waving the blonde chef off and standing back up, patting down her navy blue skirt as she did. I'll admit though, she sighed, he got me good. Why is she agreeing with him? Carne whispered, shaking his head in disbelief as Patty slapped his forehead. This is what a battle is, Don Krieg shouted, gearing himself up for another speech. I've got more ways to kill you than I can count. Now, I'll ask you again. Which one of us do you think is more fit to become Pirate King? Me, obviously, it definitely can't be you. Krieg ground his teeth together at the girl's calm statement and glared before turning to his battle commander. Jin, you're responsible for killing that cook. Leave this insolent little bitch to me. I will take great pleasure in breaking her. Don Krieg is really pissed off now. Jin smirked at the pirate's whispered words and shifted to face Sanji, hefting his tonfa. Understood, Don. He began to spin one of his weapons slowly, building up speed as both waited for the other to make the first move. After a few seconds, Jin shifted his hold and dug his feet into the wood, the brunette planning on taking the initiative in the coming fight. Jin tensing up gave Sanji a few milliseconds of heads up before the battle commander charged, the tonfa in his right hand still spinning dangerously fast. Here I come. With his hands still in his pockets, Sanji leaned back slightly and raised his left leg, shooting out with a high kick as Jin neared him. However, the battle commander had anticipated the movement and was able to shift back, just out of the blonde chef's reach. The grin on Jin's face was almost sadistic as his opponent fell right into his trap, and Sanji cursed silently as he was forced to use his hands to avoid a downward swing of the heavy ball-shaped end of the tonfa. The weapon slammed into the wooden deck, creating a hole in the ground where Sanji had been only moments before. The blonde's teeth gritted around his cigarette's grinning face before he realized that the other man's attack wasn't done just yet. His eyes widened slightly as Jin angled the part of the tonfa that was buried in the deck and used this new angle to uproot the deck directly under Sanji. Sanji was forced to jump back, splinters of wood from the broken deck obscuring his vision slightly, but thankfully, the debris also seemed to affect Jin's visibility. The blonde chef used this slight advantage to launch a kick at the brunette pirate and gritted his teeth in frustration when Jin dodged it effortlessly. The pirate flipped himself up into the air with a grin before using his momentum to slam his right tonfa down onto Sanji's neck, pining the assistant head chef to the ground. Jin settled himself down into a cross-legged position, his other tonfa braced against his shoulder and his eyes hidden in the shadow under his bandana. "I did tell you," Jin finally said, smirking darkly down at Sanji as the blonde chef struggled to take a breath with the shaft of the tonfa pressing against his throat. "I don't have a shred of sympathy for you anymore. Farewell." The brunette began to spin his second tonfa, building up speed as he prepared his next and final attack. "Just disappear from this world." Both Krieg's pirates and the chefs of the Bharati watched the scene with rapt attention, the former cheering their battle commander on. Sanji just took a drag of his cigarette, looking for all the world like he was not about to die, the sight seeming to irritate the Krieg commander. "Die!" Jin swung his tonfa down in an arc, aiming straight for Sanji's head, and at that moment the blonde spit out the still-lit cigarette. The end of the nicotine stick hit Jin almost perfectly between his eyes, not really hurting the other man but causing him to flinch slightly and close his eyes, his grip on the tonfa against Sanji's neck loosening. This small opening allowed Sanji to slide himself under the tonfa's shaft and lift himself up into a handstand, already preparing a counterattack. With as much strength as he could muster, Sanji slammed one leg straight down onto the top of Jin's head, forcing the brunette's face forward and into the hard wood of the deck. The ricochet knocked Jin back and everyone could see the blood dripping from the battle commander's nose and mouth, showcasing his injury, but before he could collapse fully he lashed out, intending to take Sanji with him. His grip on the tonfa in his right hand tightened and he swung it out blindly, the large metal ball connecting solidly with Sanji's side. The blonde chef let out a loud cry, feeling a few of his ribs crack at the impact before he too collapsed back against the deck. Neither the Krieg pirates or the Bharati chefs could believe what they had just seen. Their two strongest fighters had just gone head-to-head with some of their strongest attacks, taking each other out in the process. It was an unbelievable sight. Some of the Krieg pirates began to whisper amongst themselves from their places in the water. That cook defeated Jin with only a kick. He landed a hit on him. You don't think Jin'll be done in by him, do you? Idiots, Krieg snarled, glaring down at his pathetic excuse for men. You all have seen for yourselves what Jin is capable of. Seen the very reasons he is called a demon. He'll show his abilities soon and you'll see why he is my fleet battle commander. Even as Krieg spoke, the brunette pirate began to force himself to his feet, licking at the blood on the edge of his mouth with an almost sadistic smirk. A few feet away from him, Sanji was also struggling to right himself, one hand pressed bracingly against his ribs. Do you think Sanji's okay? Patty asked, watching the blonde chef with an almost worried expression. That attack looks like it cracked a few ribs. Carne made a quiet noise of agreement. He won't be able to take many more hits like that. This is nothing great, Sanji scoffed, smirking slightly over at Jin. You're surprisingly weak, Mr. Battle Commander. Guess the mighty Krieg pirates are all talk and no substance. Luffy frowned slightly as she watched the two prepare for another showdown before her attention was drawn to Krieg's makeshift seat on the destroyed galleon across from where she stood. He was looking at the ongoing fight between Jin and Sanji, but his gaze appeared to be off in the distance, as if he wasn't truly paying attention. Ah, he's looking away, she noted, eyes moving to the toppled mast of the galleon that connected the Bharati to Krieg's platform. Now's my opportunity to kick his ass. The raven-haired girl slipped past Sanji and Jin's stare down and hopped up onto the makeshift bridge before running full tilt towards the purple-haired pirate captain. Luffy began to yell as she charged, the noise drawing Krieg's gaze to her, and the man smirked. Now, no need to be impatient. He chuckled, shifting slightly so that he could heft the shield he still held in his left hand and aim it towards the raven-haired girl. As he held it out in the same defensive position as earlier, the golden edges of the large shield began to separate, revealing an outer ring lined with small holes. Luffy didn't stop in her run but gave the shield a curious and slightly confused look as she continued. Krieg just scoffed and raised his other hand, a small cannonball-like object held between his fingers. With a grin, he flicked the object towards the raven-haired girl, the black ball landing in the water below the makeshift mast bridge. Luffy's eyes darted down to the water for a split second. What is he planning? Suddenly, the area just in front of the raven-haired girl exploded, a large spray of water shooting up and forcing Luffy to come to a halt, One hand braced against her straw hat as the mist obscured her view of Krieg and the other platform. "I'll deal with you in due time." Luffy could hear Don Krieg's voice echoing from somewhere in front of her, but before she could move forward, a clicking noise sounded and a sharpened spike shot through the wall of water, just barely missing the she-pirate's face. "Spears?" Luffy attempted to dive to the side as more and more spikes shot through the mist with a frequency that rivaled her Gatling gun attack. A stray spike slammed into her leg and Luffy let out a shriek of pain as she was forced back away from the destroyed galleon. As she struggled to dodge the seemingly endless barrage of spears, Luffy was forced too far to one side. Her foot slipped on the slope of the mast, sending her pinwheeling back at an angle. Crap, not the ocean again. With a quick kick with her good leg, Luffy pushed herself back far enough to land heavily on the Barate's destroyed fin, her breath escaping in a loud huff. "So you managed to get away, anchor girl." "Oh?" Luffy shrieked, yanking out the spike in her leg and slamming it against the deck loudly. "That hurt, you bastard. The hell is this? Do you want to fight or not?" "Hey, fight." Krieg snorted slightly, watching as Luffy forced herself to one knee with a slightly annoyed expression. "I don't need to, little girl. The only thing I need in a battle are methods with which to kill you. That is true might as a human." The pirate commander smirked, his expression one of smug satisfaction. "I'll make sure to beat that lesson into your skin and bones, little monkey." "What?" Luffy snapped, glaring back at the man as she regained her footing. "Underestimate this monkey and I'll kick your ass to the bottom of the ocean." Suddenly, Krieg began to chuckle, his gaze moving to look at something behind Luffy, and the girl opened her mouth to snap at Krieg for ignoring her when she heard a sharp sound that sounded like bones cracking, and a cheer went up from the surrounding pirates. Luffy quickly spun around, wincing as she took in the obvious pain etched on Sanji's face. The blonde chef was on the ground, one hand braced against his chest as he struggled to take a deep breath, his wheezes and gasps just causing more blood to drip from his mouth. A few feet away, Jin hefted one of his from the metal ball at the end. The brunette pirate stared down at Sanji with an unreadable expression on his face and spit a bit of blood from his mouth. The pirates in the water began to cheer their commander on, laughing at the obvious pain on the blonde chef's face. Jin began to spin one of the tonfas again as Sanji shifted himself into a sitting position and wiped at his mouth. "PSH. That didn't hurt at all, small fry." Sanji groaned slightly as his ribs twinged, but he forced a smirk onto his face. "Shit, this guy is freaking strong. I'm beaten." Jin just straightened his posture, his eyes shadowed by his bandana as he spun the tonfa faster, readying his next attack. "Time to put an end to this. Don't bother struggling anymore." The brunette charged forward, swinging his right arm with the spinning tonfa in a wide arc. The attack would have slammed into the side of Sanji's head, but the blonde man threw himself to the side, shifting his roll into a handstand. "The hell kinda attack was that?" Sanji shouted, angrily. "Your mercy?" Sanji immediately followed up his words with a kick, the attack slamming into Jin's back and sending the pirate commander face planting to the deck. Luffy cheered, glad that Sanji seemed to be getting the upper hand, but her smile quickly faded when the blonde chef let out a cry of pain and fell to his knees, clutching at his chest. "Sanji! Sanji!" Patty and Carne yelled, watching as Sanji fell to the deck with a cry. "This is bad. He can't even withstand the shock of his own attacks." Behind Sanji, Jin was slowly pushing himself to his knees, his teeth clenched angrily. Sanji turned slightly, one hand pressed against his damaged ribs as he tried to breathe through the pain, and regarded Jin with a frustrated expression. The Krieg pirate was finally on his feet and moved towards Sanji, leaving one of his tonfa behind and instead reaching for the blonde chef with his now free hand. The brunette wrapped his hand around Sanji's throat and pushed the blonde chef onto his back, kneeling above him as his other hand gripped the handle of his tonfa. The Bharati chefs watched Jin with bated breath, ignoring the cheers and catcalling of the Krieg pirates as they waited for the brunette's next move. "Shit. I can't." Luffy's eyes widened slightly at the soft words, knowing that Jin hadn't meant for anyone to hear them. Even though his eyes were still shaded by his headband, the she-pirate could see the conflicted look on the other pirate's face. Luffy wasn't the only one to notice Jin's inner conflict. A few drops of clear liquid dripped onto Sanji's cheek and the blonde chef shifted his eyes in an unconscious effort to see the liquid before shifting his gaze back to the man above him. Sanji's frustrated glare faltered as he stared up at Jin, eyes widening in shock at the tears that cascaded down the brunette's face. Don Krieg. Jin began, his voice faltering slightly. Luffy turned her head slightly so that she could take in the pirate general's expression and, if it wasn't for the seriousness of the current situation, she would have laughed at the look of confusion and surprise on the purple-haired man's face. She turned back to Jin and Sanji at the sound of sniffling and smiled softly. Jin let go of Sanji's neck and sat back, letting his tonfa drop to the ground next to him. I can't kill this man, Don Krieg. Sanji's eyes widened in shock and Luffy's smile widened. Jin. She had known that Jin was a good person, though Don Krieg pissed off the raven-haired girl to no end. From the moment she met Jin, she had known that he was different from the pirate commander. I really can't kill him. What did you say? Krieg's shout caused Luffy to jump slightly and she turned to glare back at Don Krieg, the pirate's own glare aimed at his battle commander. Say that to me one more time. Because. The brunette sobbed, clutching his headband and pulling it down over his eyes. I've never been treated so kindly by another person in my entire life. Jin could remember the look on Sanji's face when he first handed Jin the plate of food. You can die for your dignity, but isn't it better to eat and live to see tomorrow? Damn good, right? I'm sorry, you're gonna get in trouble. There's no evidence now, is there? This is the first time anyone has ever been kind to me. Jin continued, pulling his thoughts back to the present, one hand moving to pull at his hair. That's why, I can't kill this man. Coward. Krieg snarled. The anger clearly shone on his face as he silently removed one of his circular shoulder shields and hefted it in his hand. You can't kill him? That's quite disappointing, Jin. And here I had thought that you were the one of my subordinates that was most like me. That you were willing to win no matter what. He scoffed in disappointment, staring at Jin as if the other man was a bug he was prepared to crush under his boot. I know, Don. I don't plan on ever betraying you, nor do I think that anything that we've done so far is wrong. I deeply respect your strength and I'm grateful to you. Grateful that you let me be your battle commander. It's why I do whatever you say. But, Don Krieg, if it's at all possible. Jin took a deep breath, wiping his face so he could see a little clearer, before he glanced up at the purple-haired commander and grinned shakily. Couldn't we just let this ship go? Immediately following Jin's words, the other Krieg pirates began to yell and shout, berating their battle commander and causing Jin to lower his head, embarrassed. Across the water on the destroyed galleon, Don Krieg had pushed himself to his feet, his expression completely livid. You bastard, he screamed. Not only do you defy my orders, but then you try and tell me what to do. Have you completely lost your mind, Jin? Don Krieg hefted the large circular shield in his hand, once more, attaching it to the golden armor on his forearm. As he did, the mouth of the Jolly Roger's skull separated again to reveal the cannon-like center. Don, that's the MH5, for real, this time. The pirates in the water began to panic, many of them reaching into pockets and bags and producing metal gas masks. Quick, put on your masks. It's the poison gas, one pirate shouted, slipping his own mask onto his face. The poison gas? One of the chefs asked, flinching back away from the galleon when Don Krieg was. That bastard. Luffy hissed, clenching her fingers into fists angrily as she turned to glare at Don Krieg. This was starting to get really old and the girl was just about completely fed up with this so-called pirate commander. But Don, Jin protested, gesturing loosely behind him. We were saved because of this restaurant. Krieg turned his gaze from the panicking pirates and chefs in the water to glare darkly at his battle commander. Throw away your gas mask, Jin. You're no longer one of my crew. Jin started, his eyes wide. Wah, Don, Krieg. The Don's really planning on killing even Jin, one of the pirates muttered, turning towards his other crewmates. What? That's impossible, another shouted, shaking his head. Jin's his right-hand man. The pirate grabbed his right arm and shook his hand for emphasis as another pirate nodded in agreement. That's right. There's not a single man who's more loyal to the Don than Jin. Even during that time too. Back when we had just escaped the Grand Line only to be suddenly ambushed by Full Body. Jin alone, disguised as our Don, lured full body and the Marines away. He's a man who always risked his life fighting for the Don's sake. A man who became a demon to carry out the Don's orders. There's just no way Don Krieg could kill Commander Jin. Throw away your mask, Don Krieg shouted again, watching as Jin slowly pulled the metal mask from an inside jacket pocket and stared down at it silently. Luffy was done listening to these pirates, done hearing about how loyal Jin had been to a man willing to kill him at the first sign of disobedience. With a growl, she turned BT that provided her with a way to take down the asshole purple-haired man. As if I'd let you fire your poison gas bomb, Luffy shouted, sprinting down the makeshift bridge, causing Don Krieg's angry expression to shift from Jin to the raven-haired girl. You little bitch. A pathetic little hammer. I told you I'd deal with you in due time, didn't I? Krieg smirked slightly before lifting the arm not holding the MH5 gun and slammed it into the broken mast. This caused the even more broken mast to slip off of its place on the destroyed galleon and it began to sink into the water. Luffy lost her balance and tumbled forward, doing a front roll and sliding to a stop a few inches from the water. Her eyes widened as she watched Don Krieg heft the MH5 shield, the sides reopening to reveal the outer ring of small holes. Shit. More of the sharpened spikes began to shoot from the openings and the she-pirate was forced to scramble to her feet and start running back along the sinking mast, dodging spikes as she moved. Finally, Luffy let out a breath of relief as she spied the broken remains of the Bharati fin and quickly dove off the broken mast, doing a mid-air roll and dropping heavily to the deck. Luffy's dark blue waitress skirt had a few spikes sticking out of it that had gotten stuck as she was running and the raven-haired girl forced herself into a sitting position before muttering under her breath about annoying purple-haired assholes and cheap attacks. Luffy's subsequent return and quiet mutterings pulled Jin from his self-loathing contemplation and he looked up from the mask in his hand to stare at the she-pirate. Damn it! Luffy finally snapped, rising angrily to her feet and ripping at the spike-infested, shredded navy blue skirt. She finally just huffed in annoyance and unzipped the side of the skirt and stepped out of it. Her white blouse was no longer tucked in and hung loosely on her frame, almost covering the black bicycle shorts that Nami had given her. Luffy just tossed the ruined skirt to the side and put her hands on her hips before glaring over at Don Krieg. Jin, she shouted, not turning to look at the brunette. There's no need to listen to a big coward like him. I'm gonna send him flying in an instant. Luffiko-chan. Sanji breathed. Jin's teeth ground together. Girl, don't you dare insult Don Krieg. Don Krieg is the strongest man alive. It's impossible for you to beat him. Sanji pulled his eyes away from Luffy's frame, having been staring at the half-dressed girl, to glare at Jin. You idiot, open your eyes. That guy's trying to kill you. Of course he is. Jin chuckled, the sound self-deprecating. I'm just a failure who broke the crew's code of law because my compassion got in the way. He hefted the mask in his hands and glanced down at it one more time before tossing it off the side of the broken deck and into the water. This is what I deserve. Jin, Luffy shouted, her eyes wide and disbelieving. Why? Why? Sanji shouted, sitting up and grabbing the edges of the brunette's jacket before shaking the other man. Don Krieg smirked slightly, the expression causing Luffy to shake with anger. You realize this at the end, eh? But it's too late. Die together with that blasted cook. The purple-haired pirate lifted his arm, readying his attack, and Luffy moved to block his view of Jin and Sanji and held her arms out. Hey, idiot, I'm over here too. Weren't you going to try, and fail, to make me a member of your crew? How's shooting a gas bomb over here gonna help you? Don Krieg growled angrily at Luffy, his eyes narrowing as he took in her frame without the frilly skirt. I have no use for you anymore, you little bitch. I'm fed up with your little resistance to me. Either this kills you or it leaves you just barely alive enough for me to deal with you then, now. He aimed the weapon again and shifted into a ready stance. Poisonous gas, MH5. A large ball that looked almost like a purplish cannonball shot from the hole in the center of the shield, aimed straight towards the destroyed fin of the Bharati. In the water around the restaurant, pirates began to press their masks to their faces as they waited for the coming explosion of gas. The chefs all began to swim away from the Bharati. Crap, dive and swim as far away as you can, one shouted, following his own advice after a second. Luffy watched as Don Krieg pulled his own mask from a pocket in his cape and pressed it to his face, still glaring at the raven-haired girl. She stuck her tongue out at him in retaliation before glancing around. The she-pirate quickly found two pirates near the edge of the wooden fin and quickly stretched her arms out, yanking the masks from them. "I'm borrowing these," she shouted, retracting her arms before tossing the masks in Sanji and Jin's directions. "Here, you two, use these." Jin stared at her in shock and she grinned cheekily before turning back to the water, intending to get a mask for herself. Luffy froze at the sight of the clear water in front of her, the pirates having followed the chef's example and dove underwater. Crap, crap, crap. They all dove underwater. Damn it. I still need a mask. She glanced around quickly, double-checking that all the pirates with masks were gone before sighing. Damn it. Maybe I can just hold my breath. Luffy swore she could hear Zoro in her head, shouting at her for being a reckless idiot, and she glanced down, eyes widening as she took in the sight of a lone mask rocking slightly next to her feet. Ah, a mask. This is might. Luffy heard Don Krieg mutter under his breath and she frowned before quickly placing the mask to her face seconds before the bomb flew over the deck and exploded. Purple smoke covered the deck and floated past the destroyed galleon, carried by the sea breeze. Luffy held the mask tightly against her face, glancing around as she tried to see through the weaving tendrils of smoke. Hopefully the chefs had managed to get far enough away from the blast. Her eyes narrowed when she caught a glimpse of Don Krieg through the fog, the man watching the restaurant with a smug expression visible even through his mask. The poisonous gas began to slowly dissipate, and Luffy was about to breathe a sigh of relief when the body of a seagull dropped to the deck next to her, causing the raven-haired girl to jump slightly. Stupid idiot, Luffy cursed, watching as Krieg removed his mask and smirked over at her. I'm gonna kick his ass. Jin. Let go. Luffy turned her head at Sanji's cry, eyes widening and chest clenching tightly. Jin. The pirate commander was kneeling above Sanji, pressing a gas mask roughly to the blonde chef's face even as his own skin began to take on a sickly gray color. Where's your mask? Jin didn't respond, just coughed weakly as blood began to drip from his nose. His eyes were open but Luffy could tell that he wasn't looking at anything in particular. Mask. Jin. He gave it to me. Why? Jin's arms began to shake and Luffy watched as the brunette let out a bloody cough before falling off of Sanji. Jin! Luffy shouted, running over to the two men as Sanji quickly sat up and caught the half-dead pirate commander. She froze a few feet away when Don Krieg began to laugh, the sound causing her to clench her hands angrily. What an idiot! Krieg scoffed. This happened because you made such a big deal out of one meal. I guess an idiot like you won't learn till he dies. Luffy refused to look back at Krieg, kept her eyes on Jin's heaving frame as she listened to the chefs in the water talk quietly to each other. That son of a bitch. He threw away his gas mask as commanded. To go that far. Jin was gasping, struggling to draw air into his lungs. Blood dripped steadily from his mouth and nose and tears streamed down his face. Don. He gasped, his voice barely audible. Don. Krieg. Jin. Sanji sighed, staring down at the brunette for a few more seconds before turning to glare at the purple-haired pirate. You chose the wrong man to follow. Don Krieg began to laugher than before. Are you sympathizing with my little SBAG? S-bag. Sanji snarled. Of course. What else would you call a useless idiot who refuses my order without thought of the consequences and is no good for anything? Isn't killing him before he makes the same mistake again a sign of my love? I can't believe it, one of the pirates said, his eyes wide with shock. The Don is really going to kill our battle commander. Look, Sanji and the waitress are okay. A chef yelled from inside the restaurant, sighing in relief. The doors to the berry tea burst open and Patty and Carne pushed their way outside, breathing their own sighs of relief as they took in the sight of Sanji and the small she-pirate both looking unharmed. Sanji. Ah. Carne's gaze shifted from examining Luffy's now skirtless attire to take in the dying brunette in Sanji's hold. It looks like Krieg's battle commander got a full blast of that poison gas. Sanji perked up slightly at the sound of his crewmates and quickly spun his head and glared at the other chefs. Patty, don't you have some antidote? Yeah. The thuggish chef stammered. I think so, but that's for food poisoning. And besides, he's the enemy. Whatever. The blonde snapped. Just bring it over now. Idiot. Zeph pushed himself past Patty and Carne and fixed Sanji with a serious expression. Put that mask on his face, quickly. It should detoxify some of the poison in his lungs and clear up the air he breathes. The head chef gestured behind him. Take him to the upper balcony and have him breathe the air up there. If there's any chance for him to survive, that should be your first step. Sanji nodded slightly, even as he grabbed the gas mask and carefully placed it over Jin's face. Once he was sure it was secure, the blonde glanced up and glared back at the other two chefs. Patty, Carne, move your asses. I got it already, Patty snapped, running forward. Quit yelling, asshole. Me too, Krieg scoffed. Useless, at most he's got an hour. Don't die, Jin. Everyone froze and turned their gazes towards the raven-haired girl, her expression unreadable even as her hair shadowed her eyes. Her words were soft, but there was a bite to them that caused shivers to slide down Sanji's back. Don't you dare die for that guy. You have to survive, okay, she continued, her voice growing louder as she continued to talk. 'Cause I'm gonna send this asshole flying. No, stop. You can't, Jin gasped, his voice muffled by the gas mask. Shut up. I can and I will. Calm down, Luffy-chan. Sanji quickly moved forward and grabbed onto one of the girl's arms, feeling her muscles tense under his hold. If you go straight at him, you'll fall into his trap. That's exactly what he wants, you'll die. I won't die. Sanji felt himself freeze at the look in the small girl's eyes. His chest tightened and his heart seemed to come to a complete standstill. Luffy's signature straw hat had been tilted back slightly and loose strands of hair whipped around her face. In the chef's opinion, she looked like an avenging angel, her untucked shirt fluttering around her legs cutely while her dark brown eyes promised death for the purple-haired pirate that dared to laugh at her. Sanji's grip on her arm loosened and in that instant Luffy was gone, charging straight at Krieg even as she screamed at the man. If you want to shoot me, then take your best shot. Fool! Krieg scoffed. Nothing's easier to kill than a worked-up idiot, so come on, little girl. Let's see how long it takes for you to lose that cocky attitude and bend to my will. He flicked his wrist, 5 or 6 little black balls dropping into the water around the mast. He's launching more bombs, a chef in the water hissed, watching Luffy jump nimbly onto the broken and half-sunken mast. He's gonna make another water screen. The ocean is your doom, little anchor, Krieg laughed darkly. Try and jump and my spears will make mincemeat out of you. Ahead of you lies your grave. My grave? Luffy repeated, practically spitting out the words as she ran along the wooden mast. The bombs began to explode one by one, creating a veil of water and separating Luffy and Krieg. The raven-haired girl continued to run, disappearing straight into the wall of water, her steps never faltering. Krieg hefted his shield weapon, the sides spreading, as spikes began to shoot from the weapon and into the wall of water. The chefs watching listened fearfully and winced every time they heard a small grunt or the sound of a spike embedding itself in something. Shit, she's hurt, Sanji cried, forcing himself to his feet and stumbling forward. Before he could get more than a few steps, a hand latched onto his shoulder and forced him back into a sitting position. The blonde chef glanced up in confusion, his expression turning annoyed when he saw that it was head chef Zeph who had stopped him. Geezer, what are you? The lass will be fine. Just sit and watch, eggplant. With a grumble, Sanji turned his gaze back to the wall of water right as the raven-haired girl emerged from the mist. The chef could easily see the metal spikes embedded in her left shoulder, right thigh, and was that one stuck in her stomach? His hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to watch quietly as Luffy flipped back into a handstand before slamming her feet down onto the end of the broken mast. Her movement sent a spray of water up onto the destroyed galleon, blocking Krieg from seeing the kneeling girl. The purple-haired pirate snorted, using my own trick against me. Luffy just stretched her arm back, preparing her actual attack as she jumped forward into the new veil of water. Bitch, you really want to hit me? Come on then. From his cape, Krieg pulled a large piece of thick fabric completely covered in metal spikes. He brought it out. One of the pirates shouted, "It's the Kenzen cape." That dirty son of a bitch, Sanji snarled, eyes widening with worry. It's a damn spike-covered cape. How the hell is she supposed to hit him now? What'll you do now, Hammer? You can't touch me. Gum gum. Luffy's eyes narrowed as she took in the sight of the cape, her expression one of calm fury as she stepped onto the galleon. 2 more steps and she was in front of Krieg, her right arm cocked back and her other hand braced against her bicep. Bullet. Luffy's hand slammed into the side of the spiked cape and pushed beyond, catching Don Krieg on the side of his jaw and sending him flying back. Sanji's jaw dropped in shock, and next to him, Zeph also wore a similar expression of surprise, although there was a flickering of pride in his eyes. Wah-at. She hid Don Krieg, a tool used in flower arrangement where a small base has many needles sticking out from it. I hope you guys enjoyed this chapter. Again, I sincerely apologize for making you wait this long, and I will hopefully have the next chapter up within the next month. Below I have listed a little of rough dialogue I have started creating for a scene in Logue Town when Zoro and Luffy run into each other, as well as a partially done scene as they are escaping after Luffy's execution. I am hoping to have Luffy and Zoro admit their feelings during Logue Town, and I'm still throwing around ways that I want them to do that. Please take note that these are very rough drafts and I may completely change or not even use these later on, the former in particular. I feel like I owe you guys at least a little Zolu though, because there isn't any in this chapter. So the first one is a possible dialogue between Luffy and Zoro where they can start to mention their feelings to each other after Zoro gets his new swords. They do actually meet up at this time in the show, so I was thinking of changing their words a bit and using it to my favor in this scene. The second is a partially written scene of a confrontation between Tashigi and Zoro after he and Luffy escape from the square after her almost execution. When Luffy runs into Zoro at Logatown, Shishishi. Did Yao get lost, Zoryu? I thought you were going to the execution platform? I got turned around. You mean lost? Luffy pokes Zoro's side. Ow. Meanie. Hey Zoro, is your wound healing? You took off the bandages so. Laughs, I'm fine Lu. What's with this worrying? It's not like you. I always worry about you. Blush, Luffy's far too open. She does what she wants and never thinks twice about it. Just following those damned instincts of hers. For her to be hesitant. I don't want her to hesitate, to stop and give a single thought to not continuing her adventure. My feelings. They might take her away from that. That's something I never want. To me, telling her, I love you, is too selfish. And yet, at the same time, I see my feelings reflected in her eyes sometimes. I don't know if we can keep ignoring these feelings. Ruffles Luffy's hair and grins. Don't worry about me. I've never been better, Lu. And yet, I want to believe that no matter what happens, she won't change. I hope so, cause I can't keep going on like this. Hey, Lu. Did you know, I really love you, Luffiko. Damn, they're persistent, Zoro growled, blinking against the rain hitting his face, his eyes completely focused on the small raven-haired girl running in front of him. Luffy. My Luffy. He shook his head and kept running. Wanna stop and fight them? He asked Sanji, not turning his head to look at the blonde chef. No time. We need to go, the other man replied, squinting as a shadow appeared on the street in front of them. Wait, who is that lady? Zoro reluctantly pulled his eyes away from Luffy to follow Sanji's gaze to the dark blue-haired woman, recognizing the blue and white furred coat and the pale yellow button-up shirt. So you're Roronoa Zoro. A pirate, she muttered, the words just loud enough for the 3 Straw Hat members to hear. You lied to me. Luffy slid to a stop at her words, eyeing the woman in front of her curiously. She was obviously angry at Zoro, but her Zoro wouldn't intentionally lie to an innocent person if he didn't have to. Sanji, on the other hand, was furious and he turned to the green-haired swordsman. What the hell did you do to her? He screamed, both him and Zoro stopping in front of the female marine as well. You never asked my name, that's all. Zoro smirked, looking for all the world like he was completely calm. He moved to step past Luffy, placing his hand on his captain's shoulder and squeezing it reassuringly. I never lied to you. As his hand dropped from Luffy's shoulder though, the she-pirate grabbed it between both of hers, stopping the swordsman from going any further. Lu? Zoro asked, turning to glance at her worriedly. She had never really done anything like this before and he was a little concerned. The swordsman was already on edge after her near brush with death. Stopped thinking about it, and he was worried she was hurt. Luffy just shook her head, her eyes shadowed under her wet hair and refused to speak. Zoro opened his mouth to ask her what was wrong when the marine lady began to talk again. A scoundrel like you wielding such a magnificent katana. Unforgivable, your Maitu, the Wado Ichimonji, shall be confiscated. Luffy's head snapped up at that and she glared at the woman in front of her, stepping up until she was in front of her swordsman but refusing to let go of his hand. Don't you dare, she yelled, growling slightly. You will not take Zoro's katana. I won't let you. Tashigi reared back a little bit at that, her eyes widening when she took in the small she pirate and the straw hat on her back. Stay out of this, straw hat Luffiko. I will deal with you after. Luffy hissed and opened her mouth to shout back when Zoro's other arm wrapped around her shoulders, pulling the raven-haired girl against his chest. His hand slid into her hair and pulled her close until her head was resting against his collarbone. Shush, Lu. It's okay, Captain. You think I'll lose to someone like her? He chuckled slightly, dropping a small kiss to the top of the girl's head. Have faith, Captain. Luffy pouted, finally letting go of Zoro's hand and instead wrapping her arms around his torso. I know, she sighed, shaking her head. But I don't like her yelling at you. And Wado. And you're my swordsman. She buried her face in Zoro's chest at that, feeling the heat on her cheeks spread to her ears when she heard the small laugh that the swordsman tried to fight back. Tashigi watched their exchange, too far away to hear what they were whispering to each other, but when she saw the green-haired swordsman grin she grew angry again. Enough of this, she shouted. I will take the Wado Ichimonji from your undeserving hands and then I will turn Straw Hat Luffiko into Captain Smoker. Zoro tucked Luffy more against him, shifting his hold so he could rest his hand on Wado's sheath, flicking the blade up and out of the sheath slightly with his thumb. Just try it. He smirked, amused by the woman's outburst. With a yell, Tashigi drew her sword and charged Zoro, her downward swing clashing against Wado. She was a little surprised, having not seen the swordsman draw it with one arm still wrapped around the small she pirate. He easily shoved her back, changing his one-handed grip on Wado to a more comfortable one before smirking cockily. Zoro, how dare you attack a lady? You could hurt her or Luffiko-chan, Sanji yelled, stomping his foot angrily. Please stay out of this, Tashigi's voice echoed along the street. This is between Roronoa and myself. Zoro gave a short nod, accepting her challenge before pulling Luffy back from him. Lu, get going, okay? I'll handle things here and meet up with you at the ship. Luffy opened her mouth to protest but froze, sighing after a second and nodding her head. Okay, Zoro. She rose onto her tiptoes and gave him a chaste peck on the cheek before grinning. Don't get lost after you beat her, she teased, moving back to where Sanji was standing. Zoro stared after his captain, dumbfounded. She had just. A grin split his face and he nodded, tightening his grip on Wado and turning to face Tashigi. He wouldn't lose here, he wouldn't lose ever. Zoro, if you hurt her, you're a dead man, Sanji yelled, grabbing Luffy's arm and pulling the girl past the two combatants, pointing his finger at the green-haired swordsman in warning as he passed. Same to you, idiot cook. The silence was almost deafening as both the pirates and chefs watched the famed Don Krieg drop heavily to the deck of the destroyed galleon, his unconscious face frozen in a mask of surprise. A small grunt of pain had them looking away from the pirate commander to stare at the small raven-haired girl in shock. She stumbled forward slightly before standing up straight, her angry gaze focused completely on Krieg. As one, the pirates seemed to break out of their shocked silence and let out gasps and disbelieving cries. Don Krieg got hit. What is that girl? The chefs were also muttering amongst themselves, eyes flickering between the girl they recognized as their temporary waitress and the man known as the ruler of the East Blue. She punched right through the frickin' spikes. They made sympathetic sounds of pain and winced as they rubbed their own hands, imagining just what the girl was probably going through at that moment. This can't be. One pirate muttered. I've never seen this before. Don Krieg getting beaten like this. I mean, she actually hid Don, through his Kenzen cape. Can you believe it? Luffy stood silently, feeling the blood dripping down her hand and hearing it plop against the wooden deck as she took a few deep breaths. With a small sigh, she lifted her bloody hand and tightly grasped the spike sticking out of her left shoulder. The she-pirate bit back a wince as her shoulder and hand throbbed, but she just gritted her teeth and glared at the downed man in front of her. So this is my grave? She snapped, yanking out the spike, a grunt of pain passing her lips as she angrily threw the sharp metal object against the deck. "Your grave?" Her hand moved to the one in her stomach and the raven-haired girl let out a gasp as she yanked out the second spike. It slipped from her grasp as she pulled, the momentum causing the spike to smack harshly against one of the broken masts before dropping to the ground, a trail of blood left in its wake. "My grave?" This time she reached down with her left hand to pull on the last spike that was embedded in the side of her left leg, just above her knee. She threw it away from her angrily before stumbling forward slightly. She braced her hands against her legs and took a few deep breaths as everyone watched the small she pirate silently. "Like hell. Don't decide my grave." A confident smirk spread across Luffy's face and she pushed herself up until she was standing tall again, her hands clenched at her side. "I'm not meant to die here." Don Krieg didn't move from his prone position, still unconscious, and Luffy let her smirk widen. She knew that the fight wasn't completely over yet, so she continued to stare down at the purple-haired pirate, calmly waiting. "She's far too reckless." Sanji sighed from his seat on the Baratie dock, his eyes sweeping the she-pirate's form with a worried look. Zeph slid his eyes over to glance at his protege before turning his gaze back to the raven-haired girl. "Sometimes you see idiots like her. People that will fight to the death once they've chosen their target." Sanji glanced up at Zeph in shock, his eyes wide. "That fight till the death?" He turned back to Luffy, even more worried now as the older chef continued talking. "To have that sort of person as your enemy is bad. This fight will end. Whether she wins or loses, the lass has my complete respect." Zeph smirked as he watched their temporary waitress calmly waiting to continue the fight, even as blood soaked through her white dress shirt and dripped down her arms and legs from her various injuries. It had been a long time since he had seen someone with her conviction, and he knew now that there was hope for this generation of pirates. This girl would go far, especially with crewmates like that green-haired swordsman watching her back. His eyes moved once again to look back down at the blonde teenager at his feet. The lass may even be able to convince his stubborn eggplant to follow after what he really wanted. Everyone's eyes were on Don Krieg and the smirking Luffy, waiting for what felt like hours for the battle commander to regain consciousness. Zeph could faintly hear Patty and Carne urging Krieg's former battle commander to breathe, and he fought the urge to sigh as he heard the two chefs dissolve into a small argument before panicking when Jin seemed to stop breathing for a few seconds. The head chef shook his head and turned his attention back to the deck of the destroyed galleon in time to watch Luffy cross her arms over her chest and sigh. "I didn't hit you that hard, asshole. Get up already." What's going to happen with this fight? The pirates still in the water glanced back and forth between each other as they waited for their captain to regain consciousness. "Idiot," one shouted. "It was just luck. There's no way Don will lose to a little bitch like her." Luffy heard the pirates' shouts and turned to look back at them before sticking her tongue out childishly. In front of her, Don Krieg finally began to stir, and when the she-pirate turned back to look at the purple-haired commander, he was glaring darkly. "You say you're not meant to die here?" Luffy remained silent, watching with a calm expression as Krieg began to push himself up to his hands and knees, even as the pirate continued to talk. "If this isn't your grave, then whose can it be?" Faster than most of the spectators could blink, Don Krieg was back on his feet, and in his left hand was one of his circular shields. In the next instant, he was in front of Luffy, slamming the girl back using the shield, a smug grin on his face as the front of the shield exploded. "Yours, right?" Suddenly, the she-pirate was above Krieg, her fists clenched tightly and a small glare on her face even as she stretched one leg down towards the pirate commander. "No, it's yours." The edge of her foot caught against Krieg's shoulder, and she used the momentum of her own fall and the retraction of her foot to yank the other pirate back, slamming him harshly into the deck even as she landed lightly on her feet. "The Don's down again. What the hell is happening here?" One of the pirates gulped, his eyes wide as he watched the battle unfolding in front of him. Normally the enemy dies without touching Don Krieg. The Don's supposed to be invincible. That girl. What is she? Luffy grinned as she stood facing away from Krieg, her hands in fists at her sides and the wind ruffling her hair. Patty and Carne had dragged the now awake Jin to the railing of the ship so that they could watch the fight, and the two chefs could hardly believe what they were seeing. "She's pretty good." "Yeah. No kidding." The other chefs watching the fight began to cheer and egg Luffy on, finally seeing someone who could defeat Don Krieg and protect their restaurant. The pirates saw this as well, but instead of cheering the girl on, they watched the battlefield with a mix of worried and frustrated expressions. That girl, she's actually a match for Don. It's not possible. At this rate, the legend of Don Krieg will. Shut your worthless traps, Krieg shouted, his words causing everyone to turn and look at the rising commander. The purple-haired pirate took both of the circular shields and slammed them together before hammering the new weapon straight down onto the deck. The attack cracked the already damaged galleon and forced Luffy to jump back to avoid the explosion that followed. As she jumped back, the she-pirate saw Krieg pull a handle from one end of the connected shields as a large triangular blade shot from the other side. It's the Great War Spear. He took it out, Don's most powerful weapon. Don smirked at Luffy as he watched the raven-haired girl shimmy along one of the broken masts she had landed near. I'll look forward to seeing how long you can keep away from this, little hammer bitch. Blood dripped from the pirate commander's nose and he wiped at it distractedly before continuing. Unlike my earlier measly spears that you could afford to take 2 or 3 hits from, this spear's eek. Luffy ran the back of her hand across her sweaty forehead and squinted at Don Krieg. What was that? Did it explode just now? Touch this and you'll be blown to smithereens. Krieg arched back, overextending his arms as he prepared his next attack before he slammed it straight down onto the already broken deck. The resulting explosion threw the she-pirate back off of the now destroyed platform and out over the water. What's with that spear? One of the chefs yelled, eyes widening. Luffy flipped through the air, her surroundings spinning, but from the corner of her eye she managed to catch the side of a floating piece of deck and railing and quickly shot her arm out. She latched onto the railing and let her arm retract before landing heavily. What the heck's with that spear? It explodes every time it hits something. As she moved to stand, her knees buckled and Luffy dropped to the deck again, her eyes wide. Huh? What that? My legs. The fights lasted too long. Sanji growled, gritting his teeth as he watched Luffy look around curiously. The girl's still not quite sure why she collapsed. She's lost too much blood. She won't make it like this. Damn it. The blonde chef slammed his fist angrily against the platform he sat on. I shouldn't be letting her fight for me. I'm supposed to protect her. Krieg smirked darkly. Nothing you do will work. It's about time for your so-called strength to reach its limits. Shit, Luffy cursed under her breath, pouting slightly as she continued to look around. Since the floor is in so many pieces, I can't fight the way I want. This is such a pain. Some of the pirates watching the fight gulped and glanced between each other. It looks like the Don will settle this fight quickly enough. No matter how many times I see it, that great battle spear is amazing. I mean, the harder you hit with it, the greater the explosion. Luffy was forced to throw herself backwards as Don Krieg jumped towards her, the pirate commander thrusting the tip of the spear forward towards her head. He immediately pulled it back and slashed it from left to right, making the girl back even further. Krieg continued to swing the large spear, Luffy having to execute a large amount of acrobatics to avoid the different swipes of the battle spear. Faintly, she heard one of the pirates continue his commentary. What crazy strength. 2 shields and 1 spear should weigh about a ton, but Krieg's using that heavy weapon so easily. This is the reason our Don is called the greatest. Another swipe by Krieg caused the she-pirate to stumble back, her feet teetering on the edge of the broken platform. The pirate commander just smirked, seeing an opening in Luffy's stumble, and he lifted the spear high before sweeping it down in an arc. Die. Luffy frowned, jumping in the air to avoid the first swing, leaving herself open for his second attack, and she quickly stretched her arm out as the second attack hit. Waitress! The chefs yelled worriedly. Sanji's eyes widened in shock as he caught sight of Luffy. The girl had yanked herself towards Krieg during the second attack, catching herself on the shaft of the spear and essentially negating the man's attack. Phew, she breathed, grinning slightly. That was close. Krieg glared at Luffy, his expression one of pure rage. You little bitch, he screamed, lifting the spear up and slamming it down into the ground with Luffy still attached. The she-pirate let go as the spear arched down, the throat tossing her into the air upside down. This position left her open once again, and Krieg took advantage of that, thrusting the spear forward in an attempt to skewer the she-pirate. Luffy just smirked down at the purple-haired man before slamming her fists together and catching the tip of the spear between them. Krieg grinned in triumph as Luffy's attack caused the front of the spear to explode and the chefs let out various cries of surprise and worry. "Luffiko-chan!" Sanji yelled, throwing himself forward slightly, ignoring the pain that arched through his ribs. He watched, horrified, as the girl dropped lifelessly to the deck, her body smoking slightly from the explosion. Don just watched the scene in front of him with a sadistic grin. "I ain't done with you yet, little girl." The raven-haired girl sat up slowly and brushed cinders from her arms before sighing. "Zoro's gonna be mad at me when I catch up. Maybe I can order Sanji not to tell him." "What are you mumbling, little girl? Begging for mercy? Well, after angering me to this extent, there won't even be any of your remains after I'm through with you." He began to laugh darkly, the sound echoing across the water and causing Sanji to clench his teeth together. "That damn Krieg. He just brings weapons out one after the other. This way there's no chance to. Even if he was equipped with 1,000 weapons, he'd never defeat that girl when she has a spear like that inside of her. Don't worry too much about the lass, Sanji. I feel she's got a plan. I can see no hesitation in her moves, in her conviction." "One more," Luffy breathed, giving a shaky grin before forcing herself to her feet right as Krieg attacked again. The resulting explosion engulfed Luffy in smoke, obscuring her from everyone's view until she dropped to the ground, once again smoking and darkened with ash. Krieg glanced back at her and chuckled. "Have you finally realized that the strongest man in the world is none other than me?" The pirates around the Bharati began to cheer, thinking that their Don had defeated the smart-mouthed waitress while the chefs looked on in horror. Luffy began to shake slightly, her legs sticking straight up in the air as her foot twitched spastically. The movement relaxed Sanji slightly and he watched worriedly as the raven-haired girl forced herself up onto one knee. Suddenly, she forced herself all the way up and slammed one foot into the deck, grinning brightly as the sharp metal tip of the spear cracked and fell to the deck. "What?" Krieg stuttered. "My great battle spear, what did you do?" Luffy grinned and wiped some of the soot and cinders from her face. "I just punched it 5 times. Now get ready." She settled back into her fighting stance and glanced around at the large wooden piece of deck that she had found herself on. "'Cause your spear's useless and now that I'm on this wide open space, I'll send you flying." The chefs cheered even louder at Luffy's declaration, many of them talking between themselves. "Maybe we can pull this one off." Meanwhile, the pirates watched the ongoing battle with worried looks, having never seen anyone push Don Krieg this far before. And to break the Great War Spear, it was unthinkable. "It's just a bomb on a stick now," the she-pirate continued. "I've reduced its power by half." "Is that what you think?" Krieg snapped, trying to appear unconcerned by this latest development. "Considering that even a mere bomb on a stick can easily blow you away, I'd say that I still have more than enough power to win." He shifted his stance and hefted the large broken spear up till it was in a more ready position. "Not only that, little girl, but you're bleeding all over and even took 2 blasts from my great battle spear. It seems to me that you're bluffing." "Nah," Luffy protested, placing her hands on her hips. Sanji gritted his teeth as he watched the 2 combatants from his place on the main deck of the Bharati. "That asshole's right," he muttered darkly. "Luffiko-chan looks like she should be on the verge of collapsing." He slammed one fist into the deck, ignoring the twinge of pain the hit caused in his ribs. "I shouldn't just be sitting here. I should be helping her, with her injuries. If she takes even one more hit from that spear, she'll be. Damn it. With all those weapons and armor, how is she supposed to beat him?" Zeph chuckled slightly, causing Sanji to glare up at the head chef before the older man began to speak. "You know, Sanji, no matter how many hundreds of weapons of armor one is equipped with, it is no match for that one that comes from your guts." When Sanji tilted his head and favored his mentor with a look of confusion, he continued. "This is a pirate's battlefield. This is where life and death are decided. The one who fears death and hesitates for even an instant shall fall to their doom. But within that girl, if nothing else, lies no hesitation. Perhaps it comes from her preparedness and drive to survive no matter what. Or maybe it's her conviction that fears no death." Luffy bent her knees slightly, a cocky grin coming to her face as she watched Krieg's temper begin to flare once again. She watched carefully as he lifted the heavy bomb on a stick, as she was now calling it, before the man charged toward her with the weapon ready to swing forward and slam into her. "Say your prayers," Krieg shouted. "From the moment you went against me, your defeat was set in stone." As if, Luffy scoffed, sticking out her tongue just as Krieg reached her. The purple-haired man swung the broken battle spear, but Luffy had already jumped up to avoid the attack, her knees coming to her chest before she touched down on the ground lightly. In another second she was back in the air, her hand stretching up to latch onto one of the wooden planks that formerly held the destroyed galleon's sail. "Hit me if you can, jerk." "Blasted bitch," Krieg snarled, readying another swing before slamming the bomb end of the spear into the mast, causing it to fall. As it began to topple, Luffy broke off the plank she had been holding onto and readied the sharp, pointed end towards Don Krieg. The man stood in the path of the falling mast, but with an almost disinterested sweep of the spear, he knocked the mast away with another explosion. Luffy grinned at her opening and threw the sharp piece of plank with a yell, but Krieg didn't even flinch. "Useless," he muttered, raising his right arm. Suddenly, flames burst from a device on his arm, engulfing the thrown plank and turning it quickly to cinders. "A flamethrower," Sanji snapped, glaring at the battlefield. "How many weapons does this guy have on him?" Luffy, however, seemed unfazed by Krieg's new weapon, and instead she brought her hands up into her fighting stance, still mid-air, before beginning to punch. Gum gum. Gatling gun. The attacks built up frequency as she shouted, her fists stretching down and slamming into the golden body armor that Krieg wore. The attacks knocked Krieg back somewhat, but as Luffy landed lightly on the deck, the other pirate captain stood tall and began to laugh. "Futile. All attacks are futile before my Woot's steel armor." And Luffy didn't reply to the taunt. Instead she threw her left arm back and let it stretch out behind her as she charged forward. Bullet. The she-pirate's arm retracted quickly and slammed into the center of the Don's armor, causing the man to bend over slightly, as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. The pirates surrounding the battlefield cried out with worry, while the chefs flinched as they watched blood splatter from the wound on Luffy's arm due to the force of her attack. "You insolent brat," Krieg roared, standing up straight and kicking Luffy back with a backhand to the face. His hit sent her into a broken piece of wood that was propped up like a wall, and she slammed into it hard before dropping to her hands and knees on the deck. "It's absolutely, completely, utterly futile." As if the greatest armor would break from hundreds of punches from a mere little monkey. Krieg was torn between being furious that this fight was still going on and laughing at the teenaged girl kneeling in front of him. Luffy just grinned, looking a little breathless even as her arms shook slightly. "I'd say I'm just about there." She breathed before pushing herself back to her feet. Even as she was rising she was looking around, having lost sight of Don Krieg. "Can't you see that the greatest armor and weaponry equates to the greatest might?" Luffy followed the sound of the voice up and found the purple-haired pirate standing at the top of one of the broken masts that had been propped up at a steep angle. He was grinning down at the she-pirate, his expression one of dark glee. "And those who defy the strong are doomed to die, little girl." Suddenly, he threw his hand out and 10 of the small exploding balls began to fall towards the deck where the she-pirate stood. "He's gonna throw those bombs down to destroy that whole platform. Run, waitress," one of the chefs yelled, causing Luffy to tense slightly. "Only the strong survive," Krieg laughed, seeing no way out for the raven-haired girl. "Meaning me, of course," Luffy snapped, charging towards the mast and beginning to run up the side of it. "You idiot," Sanji shouted, his worry getting the better of him and causing him to cry out. "Don't run towards him. Get away, it's a trap." Even as Luffy ran, she began to stretch both her arms back, preparing for her final attack. "How useless. Because that's exactly what I thought you'd do," Krieg laughed, bringing the broken great spear forward and slamming it down right in the she-pirate's face, causing a massive explosion. "There are some things you can't overcome with willpower alone." Krieg shook his head, thinking the fight was now over, but his eyes widened in surprise when Luffy darted out from the smoke, her face set in a determined, if not furious, expression. The she-pirate almost grinned at Krieg's disbelieving expression before she launched her arms forward. Bazooka! Her attack forced Krieg off the top of the mast and caused him to begin falling, but the former explosion was finally catching up with Luffy and left the girl panting, arms outstretched on the top of the mast. Krieg began to laugh once again as a piece of his armor cracked slightly. Your attack was useless again. This is the extent of your strength, little girl. But I'll compliment you for managing to put a small crack in my armor. Now you can die happily. The bombs that Krieg had thrown earlier began to explode, destroying the mast that Luffy had been standing on and causing the whole area to be engulfed in smoke. Luffy-Ko-chan. Sanji screamed, remembering Zeph's words but unable to stop the pounding of his heart at the sight before him. He nearly choked on air when suddenly Luffy shot up and out of the smoke, her arms stretching high above her head. And one more time, you overpompous asshole. Luffy laughed, grinning brightly even as blood trailed down her face. Bazooka. Her arms shot down and slammed into Krieg's chest, shattering the golden armor into a million pieces and causing the man to let out a cry of pain even as blood shot from his mouth. Luffy continued to grin as Don Krieg dropped towards the water, either unconscious or dead, and honestly, Luffy didn't care either way. The pirates watching the fight let out cries of dismay even as the chefs began to cheer around them. Sanji just stared, wide-eyed, at the girl, no woman, who had just taken down the most feared man in the East Blue. He was in shock. It's too early for celebrations yet, Krieg snarled viciously, pulling a net from under his broken armor even as he continued to fall. Ah, he's still alive. You little brat. Krieg tossed the net up and around Luffy, trapping her in the metal mesh even as Krieg pulled her down with him. This fight is mine. The Baratie fight will finally be done next chapter, and Sanji and Lu will finally be leaving the restaurant that has taken up so many chapters. Oh my god, am I glad to leave the Baratie behind. As promised, a little pick-me-up is at the bottom. Just a small piece of an interaction between Luffy and Sanji on their way to Kokoyashi. Luffy's finally showing that she's not as dense as most people think, and now that she's had the golden brick of revelation to the head, she's ready to talk about her feelings. Will probably change a bit once I finally get to this conversation, but here's my first draft, or at least a part of it. The fight versus the Arlong pirates will prevent a true interaction between Luffy and Zoro, but he has many cute moments between them as I can. I'm not quite sure whether to use the version of the Arlong fight from the manga and anime or take the slightly easier route of using the Nami episode version. Let me know which you'd prefer. Thanks again for reading, I've missed this. Sanji, you know about love, right? Luffy tilted her head to the side as she asked, watching her chef with a curious look. Before the other man could reply though, she continued. Usopp said there's a different love than the love I have for my brothers, and that it's only for one person. He said that when I love someone, my face gets red and hot and my heart beats really fast. Is that really love? Ah, my sweet innocent angel is feeling the first stirrings of love. Have you fallen for me, Luffy-ko-chan? Sanji asked, dancing around the raven-haired girl giddily and causing Yosaku to roll his eyes slightly at the display. I love your confusion, dear Luffy-ko-chan. My sweet perfect ray of sunshine. He knelt down in front of Luffy with a rose in his hands that the bounty hunter watching wondered where he'd hidden it. Luffy, however, just watched Sanji with a confused expression and slightly tilted head. But Sanji, you don't love me. Of course I do. My darling angel. Sanji gasped, holding a hand to his heart. Your beauty knows no bounds and. But you don't. Not me at least. You love everyone, Sanji. You're silly and nice to all the girls, but that doesn't mean you love us. Not like I love Zoro. Luffy smiled softly at the mention of her swordsman's name, her expression one of realization and real happiness. She missed Sanji's souring look and the annoyed grumble that the man let out when he heard the green-haired man's name. Finally, the cook just sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Why do you love that brute anyway, Luffy-ko-chan? There are so many wonderful men out there that would easily be better for you than that thugged-out ball of moss. Luffy just smiled wider and crossed her legs before resting her hands on her ankles and leaning forward. I love Zoro cause he's Zoro. He's gruff and he acts mean, but he's really nice to me. He gets me every time I fall in the water, and he helps me dry my hair afterwards. He plays games with me and lets me steal his food even though he pretends not to know. He even lets me sleep on the couch in the cool hammock room with him even though he got mad that one time cause I was supposed to sleep in the girls' room and I didn't want to, but still. Luffy cut off mid-ramble and just smiled happily. I just love Zoro.